Chapter 733. Professor Stephen Harvey's dormitory was too clean. The room used for the experiment felt like a modern operating room, which was out of place with the outside environment. Sister Ka Lien moved the white Gouda's body onto the snow-white experiment bed. Then, with a flick of her finger, she condensed a blade with her magic power and cut the wind cocoon around the white Gouda. The wind threads on the wind cocoon were cut off one by one, and the white Gouda's body was finally revealed. Professor Stephen Harvey looked at the 3 long needles that were nailed to his magic meridians, and then at the invisible nail that was nailing his soul in his head. He praised, "Good technique. Professor Harvey, do you need me to undo it?" Sister Ka Lien asked. Professor Stephen Harvey took out a magic card and summoned a pair of magic gloves. He said, "Wait for me to get ready." As soon as he finished speaking, he had already entered the state. First, he tapped lightly on Werthergod's face, causing Werthergod's slightly trembling body to suddenly stop. It was as if he was a corpse, not moving at all. Then, he took out several magic tools and set them up on the experiment bed with the help of the magic cards. When Sister Ka Lien pulled out the anti-magic needle and the invisible nail, one after another, the experiment bed lit up with a corresponding magic array, replacing the functions of the anti-magic needle and the invisible nail, one by one. Although Professor Stephen Harvey's explanation was quite interesting, the state of the white Gouda's soul was actually very tricky. Once the restraint was loosened, the second consciousness, which was the soul of the Demon King, and the soul of the white Gouda would overlap again. Even Professor Stephen Harvey would have a hard time separating them intact. Remember, https://m, VIP VIP. Fortunately, Dake and the others had successfully lured the Demon King's soul out, which saved them a lot of trouble. However, the following detailed examination was still very tedious. After a full half an hour, Professor Stephen Harvey raised his hand and sighed. "I've lived long enough to see this." Dake watched Professor Stephen Harvey's operation from beginning to end. Although he did not understand, he still asked, "What's going on?" Ophelia Bullard also said nervously, "Professor Harvey." Professor Stephen Harvey shook his head and said, "Even for a necromancer like me, this is the first time I've seen something like this." Sister Ka Lien was the only one among the 3 who could understand part of it. She couldn't help but frown. This demon, the soul of the second consciousness, was actually born from the soul of the white Gouda? And as soon as she said that, Ophelia Brad immediately understood. Her face turned pale, and she asked in surprise, "How is that possible?" Dake Dimming didn't understand and asked, "Wait, what's going on?" Professor Stephen Harvey patiently explained, "At first, I thought that another soul had invaded, parasitized, or fused with it, but that was not the case. You can imagine that the soul of the second consciousness grew out of the soul of the white Gouda. And according to its growth trend, under normal circumstances, it should absorb the power of God's soul and use it as nourishment for its growth. Eventually, it will absorb all the power of God's soul and bloom on its own, replacing God's soul. It shouldn't have been this kind of situation. However, although the form has changed, the essence hasn't changed." Dake frowned slightly and finally sorted out his thoughts. If the soul of the white Gouda was compared to a head, then the soul of the second consciousness was a seed stuffed into the head. This seed would absorb the power of the head and take root until it grew out of the head and bloomed. At that time, the soul of the white Gouda would be completely devoured, and the soul of the Demon King would take over the magpie's nest. And before that, they were actually in a state where they were in each other. The difference was that under normal circumstances, the reincarnation of the Demon King could only maintain one consciousness from the beginning, but now there were 2 consciousnesses. In addition, even in the soul of the Demon King that was split, there was a part of the soul of the white Gouda. In short, the fusion between the soul of the Demon King and the soul of the white Gouda was several times stronger than when Professor Stephen Harvey saw it for the first time. If he cut off the part of the Demon King's soul that was split, he would also cut off the small part of the soul that belonged to the white Gouda that was fused with it. One's glory, all's glory. I can do it." After a long while, Professor Stephen Harvey still said, "But this level of soul-cutting experiment requires not only skill but also time. This will be an extremely long process. Soul cutting, splitting, and gluing were the basic skills of a necromancer. As long as there was enough time. Even if the soul was fused into a ball of paste, he could cut it apart bit by bit. Even though the soul that was glued together like this would shatter like glass when it was cut, if there was no other way, this was the only way. Then if Dake was a little hesitant. Professor Stephen Harvey kindly said, "If you have any ideas, you can tell me." Dake said, "Since the soul of the second consciousness can devour the nutrients of the white Gouda and grow, what about the other way around? Can we let the soul of the white Gouda devour the soul of the second consciousness?" Professor Stephen Harvey nodded and praised. "I've thought of this idea before. But for some reason, even though the soul of the second consciousness was born later, it seems to be of a higher order than the soul of the white Gouda. It's difficult to subdue the top." Dake lowered his head and pondered. "Is that so? But thinking about it, this was the only way. The white Gouda was actually just a container for the Demon King. Even though various unexpected factors caused them to coexist, there was no reason for the container to devour the master. Perhaps this was the reason why the soul of the Demon King had more control over its body than the white Gouda. But this made it even more difficult. "We need to discuss this situation," Dake said. Then they walked out of the dormitory and discussed the conclusion with Professor Shierfu and the others who were waiting outside. As expected, it won't be that smooth. Professor Shierfu glanced at Professor Midya with a reproachful look in his eyes. Professor Midya rolled her eyes and said, "What are you looking at? I'm just making a prediction." Professor Shierfu turned to look at Ophelia Blood and said, "If this situation is true, you might have to be mentally prepared that the soul of the Demon King and the soul of the white Gouda will coexist forever." Ophelia Blood's face was as gloomy as the sea. Sister Ka Lien comforted her. "Actually, we just need to seal away the part of the Demon King's consciousness, right?" Ophelia Blood slowly shook her head. "I know better than anyone how terrifying the Demon King is. It's like a maggot in a tarsal bone. Unless it's completely removed, just sealing it won't be enough." Professor Shierfu frowned and said, "Then let's wait for Kazair." After a while, Dake and the other two entered the dormitory again. Professor Stephen Harvey was still methodically conducting a deeper examination of White. He asked without raising his head, "Is there a result from the discussion?" Dake said, "Professor, can you make a switch? A switch that can switch between the two soul consciousnesses at any time?" Professor Stephen Harvey said, "That's not difficult." Dake breathed a sigh of relief. "That's good. Finally, when it switches to White's consciousness, it can make the soul part of the second consciousness fall into a deep sleep." Professor Stephen Harvey nodded and said, "No problem." But then he raised his head and said, "I also have a request." Dake, "Okay, let's hear it." Professor Stephen Harvey's smile grew wider. "Count me in." This was a request to join the team. Professor Stephen Harvey was extremely interested in the state of White's soul, and wanted to know more. Dake smiled and said, "I'll ask Professor Shierfu." Professor Stephen Harvey said, "Okay." Then Dake turned around and walked out. After half a minute he came back and said, "Professor Shierfu said yes." Professor Stephen Harvey said proudly, "Of course. I've always had a good reputation. Now can you tell me what this second consciousness you've been talking about is?" Dake nodded slowly and said in a deep voice, "It's the Demon King." Stephen Harvey, "Huh?" Dake repeated, "It's the Demon King." "Oh." Professor Stephen Harvey's hands trembled and almost dislocated White's arm. Of course, it was excitement, not fear. He immediately said in ecstasy, "You said this kid became the Demon King's vessel? I knew it, I knew it." Then he turned his head and said excitedly, "Then what's with the Demon King's soul? Is it related to what happened at Easter?" Dark glanced at Ophelia Bullard, then turned around and explained the details of the matter. Professor Stephen Harvey's eyes lit up as he listened. He rubbed his hands and asked, "There's a Demon King here, and there's another Demon King in the West?" Dake said, "It should be." Professor Stephen Harvey, "Then the Demon King in the West. I mean, its soul, it can't be that easy to deal with, right?" Dake laughed dryly and said, "It depends. After all, We're only guessing its existence. Enough. Professor Stephen Harvey immediately said. Remember to call me when you're ready to leave. I haven't been out for a few years. My old bones are getting rusty. However, as if to show off his value, he added, as long as you give me a Demon King's soul that I can do whatever I want to research, and let me study the secret of its reincarnation, I might be able to deduce a way to perfectly separate Victor's soul from the Demon King's. As he spoke, he was already grinning from ear to ear. He was like an old man who had finally found a toy to play with after a long drought. His appearance was a little wretched. Dake looked at White, who was like a fish on a chopping board, and could not help but worry for him. Child, life might be a little harder in the future, but please cheer up. You're the child of a hero. You can do it. Professor Stephen Harvey's addition was undoubtedly a strong support. And this way, the team for the expedition after Christmas would be even more complete. With such a strong team, dealing with a mere Demon King shouldn't be a problem, right? Dake was a little worried as he left the room. At the same time, he thought regretfully, I originally planned to find time to go to the secret passage after Christmas. The matter of entering the secret passage to search for a new temple had been pushed back time and time again. Now it could only be pushed back. But plans could not keep up with changes, and entering the secret passage in a hurry would not yield any results. The west is the demon race's territory, which is also the direction of the Freedom City. Should I bring Aurora along? I wonder if there's a chance to take a look at the Sun Moon Temple in the Freedom City. As he thought about it, Dake realized that he was actually getting excited. He hurriedly stopped his train of thought and calmed his emotions. After that, he continued to talk with Professor Shi-Erfu and the others outside the door. Inside the door, Professor Stephen Harvey began to make the switch, with Sister Kalien's help and Ophelia's care. Before dawn, Sister Kalien opened the door and invited everyone in. Everyone surged in, and was led to the living room to sit down. Dake walked into the laboratory and took a look. He saw that 2 black metal cubes the size of matchboxes had been installed on both sides of White Gouda's head. Black metal rings were attached to the neck and wrists of his limbs. Well, there was also a metal cube where the heart should be. White Gouda would probably not be able to sleep on his stomach for a while. Professor Stephen Harvey waved at him and took off his gloves. He walked out of the laboratory and conjured a total of 3 black metal cubes, as if he were performing a magic trick. There were red and green buttons on each of the metal cubes. 3 switches, 2 backups. The red one is for the Demon King, and the green one is for White. Don't get it wrong. Professor Stephen Harvey put 2 of the 3 switches on the table and put away the last one. Leave this one with me. Press the red one, and the Demon King's soul consciousness will switch to the surface. The restraint ring on him will take effect and cut off the flow of magic power. Inject magic power into the switch, and he will be able to control his limbs. At this time, White's soul will not fall asleep. Press the green one, and it will switch to White's soul. The Demon King's soul will fall asleep, and the restraint ring will not take effect. Well, this is the request of this lady from the Blood Clan. Ophelia showed an expression of gratitude to him. Professor Shi-Erfu, on the other hand, gave one of the remaining 2 switches to her and said, I'll leave this with you. Ophelia took the switch and said sincerely, Thank you. Professor Lily blinked his eyes and suddenly asked, Don't you want to try it first? Of course. Professor Shi-Erfu narrowed his eyes with a smile and pressed the red button. After waking up, the Demon King got off the bed with a stiff expression and slowly walked out of the laboratory. I'm busy today, so I can't write more. I'll try harder tomorrow. Well, it seems that I've been awake for 24 hours and forced my schedule back. Let me see if I can keep it up. Tomorrow's update will probably be in the evening. I'll tell you in advance that I won't send any notifications in case the children are startled. I'll try to write more tomorrow. Okay. Chapter 734. What did you do to me? The Demon King, who still didn't know that he was a Demon King, immediately looked terrified and struggled with all his might. However, although its muscles were trembling, its body and limbs were involuntarily moving. Professor Shi-Erfu made him squat down and cover his mouth with his hand. Little Lily's eyes lit up when he saw this. He hurriedly reached out to grab the switch in Professor Shirfu's hand. Then the Demon King suddenly stood up and tiptoed into Swan Lake. Ha ha. Professor Lily smiled. Ophelia Brad's face twitched as she watched. However, when she thought about how the body being manipulated and played was that of her own child's, while the external consciousness was that of the Demon King who had died 10,000 times, she felt a sense of satisfaction. She was torn between the conflicting feelings of worry and pleasure. It wasn't until Professor Lily's 3 minutes cooled down, and the green light dimmed that Werther God stopped dancing. He opened his mouth and screamed, "Ah! Ah!" This cry of his was actually not a cry he had just made, but a continuation of it in his consciousness. URL https://m. vipcanchu. VIP. Although everyone present was intelligent, they all made the same mistake at the same time. They had completely forgotten the consciousness of the White Gouda. Ever since the Demon King's consciousness was drawn out, the White Gouda had witnessed the Demon King's performance as a bystander. She was even able to communicate with the Demon King in the beginning. However, not long after, part of the Devil King's soul was pinned by Sister Kalien's invisible nail. After that, White discovered that her connection with the Devil King had been severed. Although he was unable to converse with the Demon King's consciousness in his spirit sea, he could still see and hear the sounds of the outside world. After that, the Demon King was bound by the wind threads, sealed by the demon sealing needle, and hypnotized by Professor Shirfu. After the Demon King's consciousness fell into a deep slumber, the White Gouda thought that he could finally replace the Demon King. When he opened his mouth to speak, he was overjoyed. However, after several failed attempts, he was completely dumbfounded. After that, Dake and the others started a meeting in front of him. Therefore, White Gouda already knew how terrible his situation was. He also knew very well that the soul that had fused with him was the one that had caused his entire family to suffer. The Demon King. The White Gouda was different from the humans who cursed the Demon King every day, but didn't have any direct hatred for him. The White Gouda had a deep hatred for the Demon King. His father, Hero Brett God, had died in the process of sealing the Demon King. His mother, blood concubine Ophelia Bullard, had also been corrupted by the Demon King and had been tortured in the Badia prison of the Holy Church for so many years. If it wasn't for the Demon King, he wouldn't have been alone until now. This blood feud must not be forgotten. When White Gouda found out that the second consciousness was the Demon King, he felt as if he had been struck by lightning. He was extremely shocked, and when he came to his senses, he immediately started cursing, using all the vicious words he had never used in his life. However, because he was pinned down by the invisible nail, his curses didn't reach the Demon King's ears. After that, White Gouda started to think about a dead end. After thinking for a long time, he gradually figured out a lot of things. For example, when he had just entered the school last year, why was he able to understand the book, Into the Abyss, that was encrypted with a secret ancient language? For example, he was the hero's son. So why was he under half-house arrest in the orphanage? If it wasn't for Principal Cynthia St. Erdii bringing him to the Shung Malian Academy, he might have been invited to the Academy of the Holy Church to begin the second round of surveillance and house arrest. For example, he had the bloodline of the hero. So why were most of the magic spirits refined from his blood monsters from the dungeon? Now that he knew the truth, all the answers came one after another, but they were hard for him to accept. Before he knew that he was the child of the hero, he was like most human children who worshipped the hero. After knowing that he was the child of the hero, he was proud of his identity. But in fact, although he was the child of the hero, there was a part of the blood that belonged to the Demon King in his body. This sudden information was enough to make an ordinary child's cognition collapse, and he might even go crazy. Fortunately, White Gouda still had some willpower. After struggling for a long time, he finally accepted the truth. But when he finally accepted the truth and was ready to face his bleak life, he was sent to Professor Stephen Harvey's experimental bed. Then he enjoyed the one-stop service of opening his skull, cutting his heart, cutting his throat, cutting his wrist, and so on. The only lucky thing was that he didn't have the more delicate senses of pain, touch, smell, and so on. Otherwise he wouldn't be, at this time, but a dull and stupefied person who couldn't even speak. No one could imagine what he had experienced during that time. When he saw Professor Stephen Harvey, it was like seeing a rabbit on a tiger's plate, and he couldn't help but tremble. White Gouda's mental health problem could be discussed later. Ophelia Brad hugged him to her side to comfort him. Professor Earbook had already begun to test the effect of the switch. After the test was completed, Ophelia Brad suddenly patted White Gouda lightly, and he fell asleep. It's my fault for not taking care of his consciousness. I hope sleep can help him recover his calmness, Professor Stephen Harvey said apologetically. Ophelia Bullard hurriedly declined. This morning's discussion came to an end after a round of mutual rejection. After the people present agreed on their own words, they finally dispersed. However, because this place was originally a teacher's dormitory, Dake was the only one who walked out alone. He smiled a little helplessly, but his footsteps gradually became lighter. Although this incident had developed to this point, after discovering that White Gouda was the third party, and confirming the identity of his second consciousness, a part of the fog was finally lifted, and everything became clear. No matter how difficult the next action was, he wouldn't be like a headless fly running around. And regarding the foreseeable action after Christmas, he was actually a little excited. However, the moment he stepped into dorm 301, the lightness in his heart disappeared completely. The magic guiding fairies, who had been waiting bitterly in the dormitory all night, meowed as they drowned him out. It took Dake a whole hour to talk about the cause and effect of this incident to the curious babies while eating. However, he propped himself up and took a bath. Then he collapsed onto the bed and fell into a deep sleep. He slept until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He propped up his sore eyes, hastily washed up and put on his clothes. Then he busied himself again. The summary of last night's duel was secondary. The main thing was that today was already December 21st, and it was very, very close to Christmas Eve. Next, there were two major events waiting for him. One was the small experiment led by Professor Kazair, and the other was to capture the Devil King in the West. But both of these things would happen after Christmas, and he didn't need to do the preparations before then. After temporarily taking a break from these important events, he was faced with something that he couldn't avoid. Before the sky turned dark, Dake first went to find Foster Fernandy and took out the Christmas gifts he prepared for the first-year students. He temporarily stored them in the Magical Zoology Club's classroom. Then he received a custom-made magic card from a senior. That was a Christmas gift for Deanna. After going back and forth, it was already evening. Without stopping to rest, he went to Travelers Street. In the next few hours, he prepared Christmas gifts for the students and maids that he missed. Finally, he got a limited Christmas simulation card in advance from a branch of the National Duel Club, and bought a winter hat that could change its appearance. The simulation card was for Luoboat, so it was convenient. As for the fashionable winter hat, he prepared to give it to White Gouda. In order to take care of this student who was seriously traumatized, he specially prepared this winter hat that was half a magic tool. Autumn went and winter came. The weather was cold, and the students gradually wrapped themselves in thick cotton-padded clothes, wearing all kinds of scarves and gloves. These clothes were just enough to cover the restraints on White's body, but the black metal boxes on both sides of his head were not so easy to cover. The two black metal boxes were like antennas. When the two consciousnesses in White's body fell asleep at the same time, the metal boxes would turn black. When the Devil King's consciousness was switched to the surface, the metal boxes would turn red. When White's consciousness was switched to the surface, the metal boxes would turn green. This way, other people would not be able to identify the boxes wrongly and leak information. Therefore, the two metal boxes could not be covered. But the hat Dake specially selected could change the color of the material by recognizing the special color of the hat. In other words, when the metal boxes turned red, the hat would turn red. When the metal boxes turned green, the hat would turn green. This way, White could wear the winter hat in the cold winter. While keeping warm, it could also cover the two metal boxes so that he would not receive strange looks from other people. In order to prepare such a hat, Dake could be said to have put in a lot of effort. But who told him to be such a kind-hearted youth? Doing good deeds was not tiring. The next day was Sunday. Dake got up early and entered Travelers Street. Seeing that the Christmas ball was the night after tomorrow, more and more students came to Travelers Street. Dake hesitated for a long time before finally entering a famous jewelry store on the street. When he came out again, there was a ruby ring in his hand. After buying the ring, he went to the Wind Traveler's materials store and picked up a few materials that might be useful. The Wind Traveler was a low-price store. The materials in the store were good and cheap. Of course, their grades were not high. But what he was looking for were not high-grade materials. At about 9 o'clock in the morning, Dake had already returned to the dormitory. Then, without hesitation, he began his magical engineering experiment on the spot. Using the ruby ring as the core material, supplemented by various low-grade materials, and minimizing the personal characteristics, the final magic card that was refined was most likely an ordinary magic card that everyone could use. But Dake was still a little unsatisfied. In the final refinement, he added 1 point of the lunar goddess version of bliss. 1 point. It was really only 1 point. 1 point of the lunar goddess version of bliss was only equivalent to 3 points of the Dake version of bliss. And it dissected the relationship with Dake as much as possible. But this was still a very big gamble. He was quite satisfied with the final product. After putting away the item card that was finally refined, Dake was finally completely relieved. Everything was ready. All that was left was to wait for Christmas, for the Yule Ball to arrive. Before that, he still had some time to continue his research and experiments on the magic golem. Since the holidays after Christmas had already been booked, he had to hurry up with the research on the magic golem. So, on the night of February 22nd, Dake Dimming took Meow Meow and began further experiments on the production of Little Magnetic Monster. Little Magnetic Monster was a type of gray magnet Pokemon. Its body was a metal ball with a huge eye in the middle. There was a large screw on the top of its head, 2 small screws in front of its body, and a horseshoe-shaped magnet on the left and right sides of its body. The 2 horseshoe-shaped magnets had opposite magnetic poles. Little Magnetic Monster could emit electromagnetic waves from its left and right parts to block gravity and float in the air. It was an electric and steel-type Pokemon. Most importantly, it looked like a small mechanical magic golem. Before this, Dark had used the bronze eyeball as the core to create the outer shell of the Little Magnetic Monster. Later, when he was busy, Meow Meow successfully solved the manufacturing problem of Little Magnetic Monster. It installed huge horseshoe-shaped magnets on both sides of its body, causing it to release electromagnetic waves under the drive of the nucleus. At this point, the production of the magic golem was actually not that difficult anymore. If he was lucky, he might be able to successfully make a little magnetic monster that could discharge electricity before tomorrow night. Knock, knock, knock. When the door was knocked, Dake was biting the screw and studying the magic circuit inside Little Magnetic Monster. He didn't have time to open the door. Fairy tale animal Little Rabbit, who seemed to have nothing to do, stepped on the vertically placed tree stump like a circus clown, strolled to the door, and opened it. The cold wind that blew in from the crack of the door made Little Rabbit squint its eyes, and then it was immediately carried into the arms of the person who came to visit. Fairy tale animal Little Rabbit struggled with its short legs, but the huge force exerted on its body made it unable to do anything. Deanna waited until Luosi came in before she closed the door behind her. She carried Little Rabbit and walked to Dake's side and asked curiously, "Are you making a magic golem?" "Yeah," Dake answered without raising his head. Deanna rolled her eyes and said, "There's a chick protection mission tonight. Aren't you going to take a look?" "Huh." Dake stopped what he was doing and asked curiously, "Tonight?" "Yeah, tonight." Deanna's big eyes narrowed into crescents as she said with a smile. Dake couldn't help but be surprised. He actually didn't have much contact with other people in the past 2 days, so he didn't know. He originally thought that this year's chick protection mission would be held on Friday night, which was the night of the white inspection. So when he was free, he felt a little regretful that he missed such a fun event. If it weren't for Deanna and Luosi who came to inform him, he might have forgotten about the mission. "I have to go." This idea suddenly flashed through Dake's mind. Although he really wanted to join in the fun and enjoy the show, he actually had a very legitimate reason. On the surface, the so-called chick protection action was a protective activity organized to prevent the younger students from getting carried away by the romantic atmosphere of Christmas. Later on, it changed its meaning slightly and became a kind of activity that hindered love. It seemed that since a few years ago, the slogan of the Chick Protection Mission had been "No love, no harm." However, after experiencing the Chick Protection Mission for the past few years, Dake already knew that "No love, no harm" was a slogan full of double standards. The senior girls protected the junior girls and didn't let the boys easily get close to them, but at the same time, they encouraged the girls to bravely express their affection to the boys they liked. At first glance, it seemed that the Chick Protection Mission had become an activity of girls picking on boys. In short, the boys and girls of the first grade were the protagonists of this stage. "My schedule is broken again. I'm tired as a cat after running around for a whole day. I'm going to resume my normal update rhythm. Begging for votes." Chapter 735. Even though he was a first-year mathematics assistant, Dark still felt like he had to go to the common lounge to take a look. Of course, he mainly wanted to see his cousin Joey. Aurora and the two little princesses did not have to worry about the first-year students of the noble compound. It was only his cousin that made him worry. But when he temporarily put down the experiment in his hands and went to the common room with Deanna and Luoc, he realized that even this worry was completely unnecessary. This year's Operation Chick Protection was completely different from last year's. "What's going on?" Dake just came out of the staircase and blinked his eyes. His face showed a strange expression. Deanna laughed and pushed him out of the staircase. Luoc behind him also had a mischievous look on her face. These two had obviously already gone down and more or less understood the situation. However, he saw that the chicks who were supposed to be protected were now on the opposite side of the upperclassmen girls. And the leaders were naturally the two little princesses. Oh, even Joey was sitting next to them. Dake saw the three of them together for the first time. All the first-year girls of the noble compound were clustered around them. Their aura was amazing and was not weaker than the upperclassmen at all. Remember the website, MVIP, can't you? Vine the so-called upperclassmen. In fact, other than the first-year students, they were all considered upperclassmen in this situation. In other words, the first-year boys from last year had now become the wolves that needed to be guarded against in the Operation Chick Protection. And the chicks that were protected last year were now old hens protecting their chicks. But now it seemed that the chicks did not want to be protected behind them. Dake glanced around and looked at the lineup of boys near the door. Doran and the others who had already turned into wolves were among them, as if they were facing a great enemy. The first-year boys were slightly at a loss and did not know how to deal with this situation. Although the first-year boys in the past were not able to cause a storm, at least there was a sense of unity and it would not be like this. But this year's first-year girls were too strong. The boys were usually suppressed to the point that they could not breathe. At this time, they were even more useless. The atmosphere in the common room was so tense that it was suffocating. Dake winked at Deanna and Luoc before he tried to slip past them and sneak into the group of second-year boys. He didn't see Aurora among the first-grade girls, but she couldn't have been forced to participate in this kind of activity. "Hey, isn't this Dake?" However, just as he pulled away from Deanna and Luoc, he suddenly heard Dolong shout. That shout was particularly conspicuous in this deathly silent environment. Almost everyone turned their heads in the direction of his voice. On the other hand, Doran nudged Pitten's waist and whispered, "Look, the solution is here." But Pitten muttered, "How is this a strategy to break out of a stalemate? This is a ploy to blow up the field." But any second-year student would never forget the terrifying scene of almost all the girls inviting Dake to the ball during last year's Chick Protection Mission. Although the second-year girls this year were not as naive as last year, if Dake was present, they would more or less compare the invitees with Dake when they accepted the invitation to the ball. With such a comparison, wouldn't it be easy to compare all sorts of things? Things that were originally barely acceptable would suddenly become difficult to accept. And things that were originally good would become not so good. To put it bluntly, it would raise their bottom line of acceptance. This was not a good thing for the majority of the boys. Today's second-year boys of the aristocrats' courtyard did not find a dance partner at last year's Christmas ball. These days, they had been solemnly vowing to avenge their previous humiliation. Wouldn't this be difficult? Pit-Tin cursed in his heart with a bitter expression. He knew that Doran already had someone in his heart, and was not planning on finding a dance partner among the second-year students of the aristocrats' courtyard this year. He also knew that Doran had secretly sent an invitation to the head of the Magi courtyard, and was waiting for a reply day and night. But Doran already had someone in his heart, and he did not. The little fatty also wanted a dance partner. But Doran had already spoken. No matter how much Pit-Tin wanted to complain, he could not change reality. He could only thicken his face and summon Dake over. Dake was already used to being the center of attention. His footsteps did not change as he walked over to the second-year group as usual and sat with Doran, Pit-Tin, and the others at the same table. "What's the situation?" Dake asked excitedly as soon as he sat down. This year, Doran was like a little teddy bear who had jumped out of the 3 realms, and was not in the 5 elements. He was not troubled and was as excited as Dake. He immediately whispered, "It's difficult." They originally thought that after becoming second years, they could be like last year's second-year seniors and target their juniors. In the end you saw it too. Dake glanced at the 2 little princesses who were glaring at him and Joey who was hiding behind them to vote. He couldn't help but laugh. Then what do we do? At the end of the semester, perhaps the professors had reached some sort of consensus, but apart from the 6th year, all the other grades had sunk into a heavy workload. Although the little Magus had tried his best to find time in between the cracks, he still hadn't been able to do anything before the holidays. Those who wanted to take the initiative to express their affection had no time to plan, and those who had received an invitation or a confession were not in the mood to pay attention. Thus, it had been delayed again and again until now. If they could not find a dance partner in these last 2 days, this year's Christmas ball would be much more deserted than the past. Under these circumstances, this year's Protecting the Young had instead become a matchmaking event in the aristocrats' courtyard. No matter male or female, many people hoped to find a dance partner tonight. Almost all the second-year boys had the same thought. However, before they could muster up the courage to make a move on the first-year girls who looked like little lambs, they found that 2 3-shepherd dogs had suddenly emerged from the group of lambs. Every time a boy wanted to take out an invitation letter and walk towards their target, they would immediately be met with fierce glares from Anna and Anchi. Not only did the first-year girls not feel repulsed by this, but they also gladly accepted their protection. From time to time, they would cover their mouths and snicker. As for the second-year girls and above, on one hand, they were angry because their authority, fun, had been taken away, and on the other hand, they were irritated because the little princesses had made the atmosphere so stiff. It wasn't only the boys who wanted to find a dance partner. If you make the atmosphere so stiff, how would the girls who wanted to invite the boys feel? The above was the reason why the current situation had become like this. However, with the appearance of Dake Dimming, the atmosphere that had been in a deadlock for a long time finally had a loophole. Whether it was the first year or the senior girls, they all began to whisper to each other. The first-year girls, except for the 3 shepherd dogs, almost all looked at him with longing in their eyes. A few of them had already secretly reached into their bags for the dance invitations that had yet to be filled in. Unlike those so-called seniors who couldn't be seen or touched, Dake Dimming was the first-year mathematics teaching assistant. He was also the senior that they interacted with the most. Moreover, in the eyes of many people, this senior was synonymous with perfect and flawless. It was normal for the first-year students to have feelings of admiration for him. However, before the first-year girls could make a move, the second-year girls had already taken the initiative to attack. Just like last year, these girls who had invited Dake to the dance before last Christmas, after hesitating for a long time, actually stood up again this year. As they stood up, Dake seemed to hear the heartbreak of someone next to him. The sound of the heartbreak was like glass shattering, making him feel a little embarrassed. But he was still calm on the surface. With his thick skin, he rejected the girls' invitations one by one. When the girls returned in disappointment, Dake quietly breathed a sigh of relief. He was here to watch the melons, Not to be a melon, among the second-year girls over there, there didn't seem to be Eudora's figure, which made him quietly relieved again. That's right? Boys and girls who want a dance partner should take the initiative. Don't bring the fire to our side. And after those few girls, some of the boys seemed to have discovered that there was someone in the group of girls who was ready to make a move. A few of the boys who targeted that girl couldn't sit still anymore. They picked up their invitation letters and wanted to rush out. One of them even conjured a bouquet of red roses, as if he was performing a magic trick. This boy also became the first boy to be invited since the beginning of tonight's chick protection action. That's worth celebrating. And once there was one, there would be two. Since someone had already set an example, the boys and girls who were ready to go no longer hesitated. Finally, some people stood up one after another. This chick protection action finally got on the right track after Dake's arrival. Dake sat there and watched with interest most of the time. He listened to some small gossip that spread among the students from Doran's mouth. Occasionally he would meet girls who came to express their affection, but they were all rejected by him one by one. Among these girls, there were juniors and seniors. Even among the girls who were 3 or 4 years older than him, there were some who coveted him. Dake was used to it, but he didn't care too much. He looked like he had been immersed in the forest for a long time. The tower of the aristocrat house was like this. Although the towers of the other academies didn't hold the chick protection action, they actually had similar activities. Boys and girls, some liked each other, some didn't like each other, and some were sincere and utilitarian. In short, most people were working hard to get together as a couple. Among them, the most elegant were the students of the Sorcerer Academy. The girls of the Sorcerer Academy prepared many riddles to test the boys they liked. The activities of the Knight Academy were more direct. Boys and girls, surrounded by everyone, loudly expressed their schemes. If they succeeded, they could. If they didn't, they would change to the next one. If there were 2 boys pursuing a girl, and the girl was hesitant, they would use a duel. This was a program that could only be seen in the Knight Academy's tower. It had always been highly recommended by onlookers. On the other hand, the Tower of the Fools Academy was more ordinary and more reserved. The students would secretly instruct their never-before-seen magic fairies to act as messengers and deliver invitations to their targets at a fixed time. If they agreed, they would write back. If they didn't, they would ignore them. At this moment, Victoria was looking at the invitation letters that were piled up into a small hill with an adorable expression. As one of the 4 first-year Daimings of the Dimming, Victoria was outstanding in both her family background and appearance. Her somewhat mischievous personality was also very popular in the Fools Academy. Under normal circumstances, it would be normal for her to receive more invitations to balls. However, she was a magic fairy. It had been a semester since she entered the academy. If there were still people who couldn't tell that she was a magic fairy, those students would have studied magic introduction in vain. Therefore, Victoria didn't have any illusions from the beginning. It was impossible for anyone to invite her to dance. Therefore, she made up her mind early on. On the night of the Christmas ball, she would shamelessly pester Dake and dominate him. However, she still received a large number of invitations to the ball. Victoria looked at the invitations and was somewhat happy but also a little worried. After thinking for a long time, she picked out one and opened it. Hey, isn't this? However, when she opened the first invitation, it was a girl's name. She looked at it carefully with some suspicion, and confirmed that it was a girl in the same grade. Then, she picked up the second invitation and opened it again. It was her little best friend. She opened it again. It was her desk mate. She opened it again. It was finally a boy. Victoria was touched. However, when she took a closer look, she found that the invitation was from a senior. That senior described his desire for her with burning passion. He wanted to thoroughly study her from the inside out. Victoria felt a chill and hurriedly threw it into the trash can. Then, her cheeks puffed up and she pouted as she swept the rest of the invitations into the trash can. Only a few invitations from her friends in the same grade were left. Refresh it later. She looked carefully with some suspicion, and confirmed that it was a girl in the same grade. Then she picked up the second invitation and opened it again. It was her little best friend. She opened it again. It was her desk mate. She opened it again. It was finally a boy. Victoria was touched. However, when she took a closer look, she found that the invitation was from a senior. That senior described his desire for her with burning passion. He wanted to thoroughly study her from the inside out. Victoria felt a chill and hurriedly threw it into the trash can. Then her cheeks visibly puffed up, and she pouted her lips. Chapter 736. Deanna was under a lot of pressure. In terms of relationship, she and Luosi had been the closest to Dake since they entered the first year. Their relationship was so close that rumors between Dake and them could often be heard in the academy. Moreover, some of the rumors were filthy and extremely embarrassing. Although she also had those embarrassing thoughts, she didn't act on them in the end. And if she didn't act on them, it was naturally equivalent to nothing. Her and Luosi's plan had always been slow. They tried to break down Dake's heart step by step through day after day and time, and finally reap the fruit and tie the knot. This method of boiling the frog in warm water was indeed more suitable for them. After all, they were still young and not even adults. Moreover, they were very reserved and relatively traditional in their feelings. If things were to proceed normally like this, perhaps success would follow naturally. However, there were many things in this world that were always full of variables. Once the timeline of something was stretched to a certain extent, then variables would always follow one after another. First website. https://m. Vipcanchu. VIP for Deanna and Luosi. Eudora's appearance was a small variable, and the appearance of Panduola Doragon was a huge variable that could not be ignored. Dake's relationship with Panduola had not been hidden. Deanna and Luosi had known of her existence for a long time, and even built a pretty good friendship with her through Dake. But before that, Dake's attitude towards Panduola was not absolutely different from his attitude towards them. Dark had always been passive, and there were signs that he had deliberately avoided getting too close to her. For people he had a good impression of, he basically maintained an ambiguous attitude of not rejecting or taking the initiative. However, all the signs during this period of time showed that he was turning from passivity to initiative. If the person who was turning from passivity to initiative was herself, Deanna would definitely hug the panda and roll around on the bed. She would be so excited that she wouldn't be able to sleep for several days. However, that was not the case. Deanna was actually afraid that her sudden confession would be rejected. However, if she didn't take action now, she was even more afraid that she wouldn't even have the chance to express her feelings. Therefore, during this period of time, she had been carefully preparing Christmas gifts and making an invitation to the ball. But every time she wanted to send out the invitation to the ball, she would hesitate, because she suddenly realized that with her relationship with Dark, sending out an ordinary invitation to the ball had lost its meaning. This reminded her of last year's Christmas. On the same night before Christmas, she had invited Dake to the dance party, only to find out that Panduola had beaten her to it. However, Dake didn't reject her invitation because of that. Instead, he invited her to the second half of the dance party. She agreed and was very happy. At that moment, she knew that Dake liked her. But now, it seemed that it wasn't the love she wanted. If this year was the same as last year, and he sent out ordinary invitations in private, the probability of getting the same result would be more than 90%. She didn't like mathematics because it had too many twists and turns. However, she liked the mathematics he wrote, so she bit the end of her pen and worked hard to learn it. Subconsciously, she used probability. More than 90% was actually considered very low. If it wasn't for the fact that 100% was too absolute, she would have said 100%. Dake definitely wouldn't reject her. However, she didn't want to be his partner for the second half of the dance party. She wanted to be the first partner to enter the dance floor with him in the first half. Thus, under Rose's persuasion, Diana finally made up her mind to send out the invitation to the ball in front of everyone under the pretext of Operation Chick Protection. Although it was only an invitation to the ball, with Dake's intelligence and gentleness, he definitely knew what it meant. Deanna wanted to use this method to clearly tell Dake that she was no longer ignorant. She wanted Dake to face her feelings and not treat them as family. even if this caused a rift between the two of them. There was no other way. If she didn't do anything, it would definitely be late for this year's Christmas ball. Dake wouldn't let her replace Panduola's position because of this or that. However, she had to prepare in advance, a whole year in advance, to pave the way for next year's Christmas ball. If she started to pave the way now, there shouldn't be anyone earlier than her, right? Hurry up and go. Luoxi's voice came from behind with a slight tremble. Deanna tightly grasped the ball invitation in her hand and tightly pursed her pink lips. It was not easy for a girl to send an invitation to a ball that was destined to not get the result she wanted in front of so many people. However, after a long mental journey, the invitation was finally sent to Dake Dimeng. Dake Dimeng raised his hand and grabbed the corner of the invitation. He looked at Deanna, who was trying her best to remain calm, and the smile on his face was no longer casual. The young master of the Duke's mansion, who had been laughing ever since he came downstairs to eat melons, was finally defeated. Aye. Did you receive it? Deanna's voice became as soft as a mosquito's, revealing the unique shyness of a girl. Dake exerted force on his fingers and pulled the ball invitation to his side, but it didn't move. He was silent for half a second because of this, and then he whispered, I received it. Of course he received it, and he had received it a long time ago. However, Deanna was still too young. Although he watched the first and second grade students indulging in their youth with relish, he wouldn't change his mind because of this. 12 or 13 years old was really too young. Although the age of adulthood in this world was once set at 14 years old, after the arrival of peace, the age of adulthood had been changed to 16 years old. In the next few years, it would be further changed to 18 years old. According to the age of the current world, 16 years old was considered a minor. Dake's bottom line for dating was also 16 years old. Of course, this was a requirement for the person he was dating. After all, his body's age didn't count. The boys and girls in this world grew up faster on average, and sometimes people would be confused about their age. However, this kind of confusion wouldn't happen to Deanna. Deanna was originally more petite than her peers, but her heart had a charm that didn't match with her body size. In short, she looked younger than 13 years old. Before she grew up, Dake couldn't give her a positive response. By the way, Panduola was already 16 years old. The truth of the matter was sometimes this simple. Dark's active and passive behavior was also affected by the environment he was in. If he could already roughly control the sudden growth of bliss, he dared to be slightly more active. As for senior sister Pandora, she had already grown up and exceeded his age limit. Besides that, Dake was actually very clear about what he liked and what he didn't like. Because of his gradual control of bliss, he was actually very sensitive to the emotional changes of the people around him. Just like Luoxi's emotional changes, she had hidden them very well, but in fact, in Dake's eyes, they were as obvious as a mark of favorability. In short, Dake accepted Deanna's invitation to the dance party. If it was like last year, it wouldn't be so obvious this time. However, he had already changed his approach and rejected all the other letters except for this dance party invitation. As a result, his action of accepting Diana's invitation letter seemed a little different. Of course, in the eyes of the second years, Deanna was probably already Dake's woman, so this little surprise was only at the level of as expected, or I knew it. However, among the first years, there were still some people who widened their eyes unhappily. However, because of their identity and status, they couldn't do this kind of thing in front of the public, so they could only stare and watch. Deanna, who received Dake's response, blushed uncharacteristically. She suppressed her shyness and ran back to the second-year girls. The second-year girls of the aristocratic academy all smiled dotingly at her. Even the few girls who were rejected by Dake smiled kindly and habitually fed her. Luoxi hugged Deanna and said like a mother, "You did very well, good girl." Deanna hid in her arms. Eh. While most people's attention was focused on Deanna, Doran leaned over to Dake's ear and whispered, "What exactly are you thinking?" Doran was quite sharp sometimes. Dake put the dance party invitation into his card bag and didn't open it on the spot. He didn't answer Doran either. At this time, the more he said, the more mistakes he would make. No matter what answer he gave, it wouldn't be appropriate. Fortunately, the melodramatic drama between the male and female seniors that followed quickly attracted most of the people's attention. Dake watched it with interest and pretended that nothing had happened. This unique Operation Protect the Chick lasted until 9:30 in the evening. Because it was already the holidays, the students didn't have any intention of going back to sleep. Even though the Operation Protect the Chick was already in a half-finished state, the common lounge was still noisy and lively. A few leaders suddenly proposed to decorate the common lounge in the next 2 days. The students responded loudly and looked forward to Christmas more and more. In this lively atmosphere that didn't dissipate for a long time, Dake Dimming quietly left the common lounge and returned to dorm 301. Meow Meow, who was sitting on the lab table and writing magic circuit boards, glanced at him with an extremely disdainful expression and continued to work hard. Dake couldn't help but smile awkwardly and walked to the lab table subconsciously. But after sitting down, he suddenly slapped his forehead and took out Deanna's dance party invitation from his card bag. The cover of this dance party invitation was dark with bright stars all over. On the upper right corner, there was a galaxy vortex, and in the vortex, there was a drawing of Santa Claus driving a car. Compared to most of the invitations that had Christmas red as the main color, Deanna's invitation could be said to be very carefully selected. Dark paused for a moment before opening the cover, revealing the contents inside. Since it was a dance party invitation, the invitation and the names of the two people were naturally written inside. Dake's eyes quickly fell on the picture of a cat and a bear next to the two names. In the next second, a weak mana fluctuation suddenly appeared in the invitation letter. Then, the little bear on the paper suddenly broke out of the paper and grew with the wind. In the blink of an eye, it grew to the size of a basketball and then with a paw sound, it hugged Dake's face. What a cheek hugger! Dake pulled the cheek hugger off his face expressionlessly. In his mind, he was already imagining the miserable scene when he opened it in the common lounge. The little bit of guilt that he originally felt towards Deanna also disappeared without a trace. After returning to the dorm, Deanna looked at the dance party invitation on the desk and suddenly let out a cry of panic. "What's wrong, Nana?" Luosi frowned and asked. Deanna grabbed the dance party invitation on the desk and stammered, "It's over. It's over. I gave him the wrong invitation. I gave him the one that I made at the beginning." Luosi immediately understood after being stunned for a short while. Suddenly, his face changed and he covered his head. "Stupid." Dake continued to make the Little Magnetic Monster Golem. Little Magnetic Monster was a Pokemon that could discharge electricity. If he could successfully make a Little Magnetic Monster Golem with the ability to generate electricity, he would have the foundation to build a small power plant. Although the magic engineering technology in this world was enough to satisfy most of the daily needs, Dake still missed electrical appliances. If possible, he didn't mind making some electrical appliances. The creation of magic tools was a part of alchemy. After half an hour, Dake gradually got into the zone. He looked like he was going to finish making the Little Magnetic Monster that very night. However, at 10:30 p.m., there was a dong 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 sound outside the door again. Meow, the dream demon slowly floated to the entrance and then opened the door. The night breeze blew in through the gap of the door, and a strong fragrance also blew in. The magic engineering fairies, who had already curled up in their small beds and were about to fall asleep, almost subconsciously opened their eyes wide. Then a few little gluttonous ghosts got off the bed. After more than a month, Aurora Montierfali once again appeared at the door of dorm 301 with a midnight snack. Her bangs were flat, and she was obedient and cute. There was a faint blush on her white and tender cheeks. It was unknown whether it was because of the heat or some other reason. She pushed the door open and entered, her little finger slightly trembling in nervousness. "Good evening, Dake. I stewed a pot of chicken soup." Surrounded by the little cuties, Aurora walked into the dorm very naturally, and then put down the tray on the desk. "Yes, I have something to tell you." Dake put down the tools in his hands. "And see you tomorrow morning." Chapter 737. The night was like silk, and amidst the thick fragrance of meat, Aurora was carefully raising her head and secretly looking at the side profile of the exquisite jade-like face in front of her. That smile that overflowed from the corner of her mouth, because she was enjoying the delicacy, always made her little heart thump. Every time this happened, she would feel that all her research and hard work had been worth it. It was indeed true that love was born after a long time. Giving and enjoying over a long period of time could actually improve a relationship. But was it love? Love was something that couldn't be clearly described. "Is something the matter?" she asked softly. Her heart was filled with thoughts about the ball. But Dake didn't mention the ball. "After Christmas, we're going to the West." The West? Aurora was startled, and her expression became serious. The West was the territory of the demons, but that was already in the past. Although the environment in the West was still dangerous, the demons' territory was far less terrifying than it used to be. Remember the URL. MVIP, can't you? 6. After more than 10 years of rest, the kingdom was now ready to make a move on the land in the West. All the forces had the intention of opening up a wasteland in the West. And in the early stages of the kingdom's reconstruction, the City of Freedom had already been established between the West and the kingdom. Naturally, it became a springboard for the development of the West. Therefore, the City of Freedom's presence was gradually becoming stronger. And such an obvious piece of meat would of course attract the attention of countless jackals and wolves. Not only did these jackals and wolves not contribute during the construction of the City of Freedom, but they also frequently obstructed it. After the City of Freedom had shown its great value, they wanted to interfere and pick the peach. How could there be such a good thing in the world? In order to prevent the hybrid homeland that she had painstakingly built from being eaten away by these greedy people, City Lord Montefiore almost took on everything by herself. But there was a limit to how much a person could bear. The situation in the City of Freedom was becoming more and more dangerous with the flow of time. After more than 10 years of development, the human kingdom had recovered to its peak. The magical beasts in the West naturally multiplied after more than 10 years of reproduction. Although the adventurers in the City of Freedom hunted magical beasts day and night, compared to the magical beasts in the West, it was still a drop in the bucket. Moreover, the destruction of the demon race was not entirely a good thing. The demons demonized wild beasts and created a large number of magical beasts, but at the same time, they controlled and restricted the reproduction of magical beasts. Countless magical beasts under the control of the demons died in the meat grinder called war, which in turn kept the number of magical beasts at a constant balance. As the first magical beasts multiplied and formed new species after countless years, the remaining magical factors in their bodies decreased. More and more magical beasts developed rationality, and were no longer irrational beasts. Their meat had also become edible. The last remaining bit of demonic nature was almost nothing to the demons. Therefore, when the demons were still around, the number of magical beasts never went out of control. But now that the demons in the West had been completely wiped out, the magical beasts had lost their natural enemy, and once again stood at the top of the food chain. Their reproduction was no longer restricted, and in a short 10 years, they had multiplied more than in the previous decades. As for the humans who had exterminated the demons, they had no time to take over the responsibilities of the demons because of their heavy losses. Due to the combination of many factors, the magical beasts in the West were developing into a huge threat that was perhaps not inferior to the demons. Even if it was just to nip that threat in the bud, it was imperative to open up the wasteland in the West. But under these circumstances, the humans were still scheming against each other. The current situation in the Freedom City was very bad. Aurora was very familiar with the current situation in the Freedom City, but one of the reasons why Mayor Montefiore had sent her to the Duke's residence and sent her to the Shungmalian Academy was to keep her away from danger. In other words, the situation in the Freedom City had already reached such a dangerous level. "Going to the West, is there something to take care of?" Aurora asked in a low voice. Dake drank chicken soup and bit into shredded meat, saying, "I can't say the specifics, but there's a high possibility that they'll settle down in the Freedom City." Aurora turned her little head and asked, "Who will be going?" Dake thought for a moment and said, "Professor Earbook will lead the team." "So it's a mission from the academy." Aurora let out a small sigh of relief and said, Then, we don't have to do anything, right? Dake nodded and said, yes, with the professors there, we naturally don't have to do anything. It's just that we're not sure if we'll need to go as far as the Freedom City. But if we do, you don't have to follow the team for the time being. Aurora subconsciously asked. Then what about you? Me? Dake muttered. Although I really want to say that they can't do without me. I don't think they'll have anything to do with me. I'm participating in this expedition with the mentality of increasing my experience. Aurora's eyes gradually lit up, and she said with slight excitement, then if there's a chance, I'll take you around the city. Dake smiled and said, of course, I also want to know how the Freedom City looks like. It was said that the Freedom City had already established an adventurers' guild, and was gradually becoming the largest gathering center of adventurers in the country. It wasn't easy for him to be reborn into a world of swords and magic. Dake actually wanted to find time to experience the life of an adventurer in those otherworldly transmigration novels, such as going out of the city to slay a slime or something. This trip with the professor this time, he'd just take it as a scouting trip. After the end of his second year, he could consider accompanying Aurora to the Freedom City again for a month or two. As the two chatted, Aurora began to introduce the various sights and sounds of the Freedom City. She and the Freedom City grew up at almost the same time, so her understanding of the Freedom City was already ingrained in her bones. She casually mentioned some fascinating and interesting things that made people want to go and take a look. Unknowingly, the large pot of chicken soup had been finished, but the magic elf quietly put away the bowls and chopsticks and listened attentively, a yearning for the Freedom City gradually appearing in their eyes. Then, at 11 o'clock at night, Aurora carried an empty plate and went out with a satisfied look on her face. It wasn't until she returned to the dormitory on the second floor that she suddenly woke up, and her small face instantly fell. Her invitation to the ball was still hidden in her card bag. Why do I feel like I've forgotten something? After eating and listening to the story, Dake Dimming slightly shook his head and continued to make the little magnetic monster, golems. As a result, the first little magnetic monster, golem, was successfully completed before 12 o'clock. Then, when Dake ordered it to release electromagnetic waves to float in the air, it exploded. Fortunately, the tower dormitory's soundproofing was good. Otherwise, how many students would wake up in the middle of the night from their dreams? Dake's face darkened as he carefully took the bronze eyeball out of the golem's remains. After inspecting it, he sighed softly. Good thing it's not broken. It wasn't easy to find a core like the bronze eyeball that was suitable for the little magnetic monster. If it was broken, he wouldn't be able to find a replacement in such a short time. He wasn't discouraged by the failure. After a simple tidying up, he actively searched for the reason for the failure and prepared to make another one the next morning. He went to bed at 1 o'clock and woke up at 6 o'clock. After 5 hours of sleep, Dake Dimming opened his eyes and found that Meow Meow was still sitting on the experiment table, doing nothing. He knew that the magic elf didn't need much sleep, so he let it be. After a simple wash, Dake came to the experiment table and found that Meow Meow had finished making the little magnetic monster's shell and was rushing to engrave the magic circuit. Dake sat down and worked together with it. With Meow Meow's tireless efforts, the second little magnetic monster was finally created before 8 o'clock. Compared to the first little magnetic monster, the second little magnetic monster was obviously much better. Not only could it release electromagnetic waves to shield itself from gravity and float in the air, but it could also successfully discharge electricity, electrocuting itself. Boom. After another failure, the dejected man and cat decided to start their third experiment. After the first two failures, Dake and Meow Meow finally had a slight breakthrough in their golem-making skills. They successfully created the third, little magnetic monster, before noon. This little magnetic monster finally stopped electrocuting itself, but once it discharged electricity, the electromagnetic waves it continuously emitted would be disrupted, and it would fall from the sky. Obviously, this was another failure. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the fourth little magnetic monster was created. At 4 in the afternoon, the fifth little magnetic monster died. At 7:30 in the evening, The sixth little magnetic monster, the bronze eye, exploded. This bronze eye, which had been through 6 little magnetic monsters, finally chose to self-destruct, unwilling to accept the humiliation. At 8 in the evening, Dake put on his coat and resolutely took Meow Meow with him. He chose to go out. On the night of December 23rd, Traveler's Street was decorated with lanterns and colored banners. It was very lively. Christmas trees could be seen everywhere with all kinds of colored lights. The faces of passers-by reflected the red and green colors, and they were full of smiles. However, in such a lively festive atmosphere, there was a blonde young man with his cat going door to door, looking for a suitable core to be used on a little magnetic monster. Meow. Meow Meow suddenly grabbed a light yellow eyeball and held it up with both hands. The dispirited look on its face disappeared. Dake curiously walked over and saw the 2 words Thunder Beast on the counter where the eyeball was placed. The eyeball of a Thunder Beast? Dake couldn't help but frown. As the name suggested, Thunder Beast was a type of magical beast with the thunder attribute. They varied in size, but most of them were in the shape of a leopard. They had long, lightning-like horns on top of their heads, and could release thunder and lightning from their horns. The most terrifying ability was that they could use their long horns to summon thunder and lightning in stormy weather, guiding the power of nature to kill their opponents. This was how the Thunder Beast got its name. However, the Thunder Beast's eyeball didn't qualify as the core of a golem. Because it was a biological organ, it would rot. Even if it was successfully used to create a high-quality golem, it would be difficult to extend its shelf life. Even if it was sealed in a magic card like the Curse Cage, it wouldn't change this flaw. It's indeed easier to create a golem using biological organs, but unless you can make the golem come to life, or use an extremely difficult alchemy technique to mechanize biological organs, it's just a coincidence. Dake shook his head. He didn't master the alchemy technique to mechanize biological organs. However, in the face of his doubts, Meow Meow shook its head vigorously. Even its dead fish eyes were wide open, and it kept meowing. Dake was silent for a while, and then he nodded. Then he took out his academy card and bought the Thunder Beast's eyeball. Back in the dormitory, the man and the cat started to create the golem without stopping. Since the Thunder Beast's eyeball could naturally store and release electricity, part of the circuits used in the production of the golem could be abandoned, and the production process was shortened by a lot. At 10:40 p.m., the 7th little magnetic monster was created. It wasn't until the production was completed that Dake finally realized the uniqueness of this Thunder Beast's eyeball. This was a mutated Thunder Beast's eyeball. Not only did it have the thunder attribute, but it had also mutated into the steel attribute. It was a natural core. Believe in Meow Meow. Believe in treasure-gathering technique. Dake held the little magnetic monster in excitement. The Thunder Beast's eye was perfectly fused with the surrounding steel. The little magnetic monster, which was made with the little magnetic monster as its core, had much better control over magic power than the little magnetic monster, made with the bronze eye. He couldn't wait to order the little magnetic monster to demonstrate. The horseshoe-shaped magnets on both sides of its body slowly rotated, and its whole body floated under the magnetic force. It was very stable. Discharge. The little magnetic monster's big eyeball suddenly fixed and released a golden electric current, hitting the target accurately. It's finally done. Dake's face lit up with joy, and he immediately tested its intelligence. 10 minutes later, he had an understanding of the little magnetic monster's level. It was roughly between 1.0 and 1.5. Although it still wasn't at the level of a simulacrum level because the little magnetic monster was a mechanical creation, it was actually very close. If he used this little magnetic monster to hand in his homework, it would definitely be at the level of an excellent, regardless of whether he passed or not. Dake's mind turned, and he took out the third spell cage that he had made in his spare time. Meow Meow Meow. Meow Meow squatted on the table and stared at him excitedly, urging him to do it. In the name of Dake Dimung, I summoned the spell cage. Dake focused a little and immediately cast the usual summoning spell, sealing the little magnetic monster into the spell cage. Soon the spell cage in his hand became spell cage, little magnetic monster. O greater than over equal to mouth O. Chapter 738. Curse Cage was a type of magic card that could temporarily seal demonic spirits, golems and other simulated life forms into the card and be used as a magic elven card. Generally speaking, it could give demonic spirits offensive abilities, but it did not have any effect on the golems that could fully display their abilities. Therefore, its existence was not very meaningful. Most of the time, it was used as a portable device to carry the golems. However, with the demise of the alchemy profession, there were fewer and fewer people who could make golems. However, the existence of a thing always had its own value. The key was whether someone could dig out its shining point. It was said that among the celebrity duelists, there was an active duelist. Because there were a large number of high-level golems in his house, he was good at using the curse cage to seal them up and use them in magic duels. He was invincible. Of course, that was only a derivation and expansion of the most basic usage of the curse cage. Since ancient times, there was only one person who could really use the curse cage to its full potential, and this person was looking at the curse cage card in his hand with joy. In the card, there was a wooden cage hanging, the word curse flashing, and a round-headed little magnetic monster was floating quietly. This was the first time Dake sealed a golem in a curse cage. Although he had done many conceptions before he really tested it, it was only at the stage of conceptualization. Remember, https://mvip can't you? VIP. He looked at the star rating above the card. Thanks to the high grade of the Thunder Beast's eye, the star rating of this little magnetic monster was higher than Curse Cage, Little Devil Monster, and Curse Cage, Sub-Ancient Beast. There were 3 stars depicted on it. Its 3 measurements were typical of high attack and low defense. However, the attack value of the Magic Elven card generally referred to the attack that can be achieved by using the most correct attack method. The little magnetic monster had small arms and legs. It was impossible to expect it to shoot itself out like a cannonball, right? Therefore, its attack basically referred to magic attacks. After Dake looked at it briefly, he immediately injected mana to get further information. Card name, Little Magnetic Monster. Type, Elven card. Level, *****. Race, Machine attribute, Electric/Steel. Mana, 1000 attack, 1200 defense, 600 ultimate skill. Discharge. In order to shorten the production time, Dake did not add too many complicated elements into the little magnetic monster. Therefore, it was understandable that the little magnetic monster only had 1 ultimate skill. However, according to Dake's initial prediction, he thought that this little magnetic monster would have the chance to acquire the 2 ultimate skills, electromagnetic wave and electric shock. Now, although it could release electromagnetic waves to make itself float in the air, it was a pity that it could not form the killing move, electromagnetic waves. And the electric shock that he had originally guessed was upgraded to the even more powerful discharge. The difference in power between discharge and electric shock was a whole fold. Moreover, it had changed from a single target attack to an AoE attack. This was obviously a huge enhancement. That's alright. Dake pondered for a moment and injected more magic power to read the detailed description. Discharge. Little magnetic monster releases a dazzling electric current to attack all targets around it. Sometimes it can paralyze the target. With a probability of paralyzing effect and a high-intensity AoE attack, discharge was indeed a good ultimate skill. The only problem was that it did not seem to have any direction. This meant that when the little magnetic monster used discharge, it would indiscriminately attack the opponents around it, which was not convenient in practice. However, this little magnetic monster was a golem, not a familiar. It was difficult to change the attributes and ultimate skills of a familiar, but it was different for golems. Changing armor, upgrading circuits, and adding weapons could allow a golem to complete the next step of transformation. The little magnetic monster before him was only a basic model. First, activate intelligence. Dake raised the magic card and summoned it under Meow Meow's unblinking gaze. In the name of Dake Dimung, I summon the little magnetic monster. With a flash of electricity, the little magnetic monster, which had not changed at all compared to before, appeared. Then he took the card bag that the sweet little cotton-padded jacket passed to him with its ribbon tentacles, and picked out the only Gluttony Great Sin card. Gluttony 2. Gluttony corresponded to Venus, and its main attribute was steel, which was a perfect match for the little magnetic monster. However, in fact, using any type of Great Sin card seemed to be able to activate intelligence for the magic fairy. Dake himself did not have a deep understanding of this, so he could only vaguely feel that it was more appropriate to use the corresponding type of Great Sin card to activate intelligence for the magic fairy. Without further ado, under the light of Gluttony 2, the little magnetic monster's big and empty eyes gradually condensed a divine light. The core difference between a mimic golem and a similar golem was the difference in intelligence level. A mimic golem's intelligence level was as high as 2.5, and its logic circuit was not inferior to that of a dog with a higher IQ. It was even smarter than the average magic fairy. It was actually very, very difficult for an alchemist to cross this threshold called intelligence. However, Dake took a different path, or rather, opportunistic, and easily crossed it. When the light of Gluttony 2 faded, the little magnetic monster's intelligence level had jumped by 3 levels, directly surpassing the patrolling golems of the academy, and reaching a level that even the magic fairies and magic fairies could not match. Rar. The moment it activated its intelligence, it suddenly narrowed its eyes, and the 2 horseshoe-shaped magnets spun at high speed, and its body flashed with a golden electric light. In Dake's mind, he suddenly remembered the electrocution that a certain electric rat used on its master, and almost subconsciously retreated. He was not a newbie, and he could not withstand the electric shock. Gluttony 2 made the little magnetic monster's appetite soar, but it fed on electricity, and there was no electricity in the whole room, which only made it restless and restless as it spun around in the air. Fortunately, other than that, it did not do anything else, which was reassuring. Dake lowered his head and looked at the magic card. Great Sins 2 could allow Curse Cage, Little Evil Magical Beast, to obtain a new Surekill skill. Allow Curse Cage, Subancient Beast, to evolve into a 3-star subspecies, and allow Fantasy Beast, Ibu, to obtain a field skill. However, it did not have any special strengthening effects on ordinary Pokémon. However, he would only know the specifics after looking at it. As he looked at it, his heart suddenly moved. He found that this Curse Cage, Little Magnetic Monster, did indeed have an additional Surekill skill. Analyze. Analyze. Little Magnetic Monster has a strong analytical ability, and can independently collect information for analysis. After a complete analysis of the target, it can release a Surekill skill that can increase damage by 0% to 100%. A skill that increases the damage of a Surekill skill. It has a strong analytical ability. Dake raised his head, and his smile gradually brightened. Curse Cage, Little Magnetic Monster, was only a 3-star magic fairy with an attack power of 1,200. Even if the damage was doubled, it was not much. However, having a strong analytical ability was completely different. This meant that this 2-star Curse Cage, Little Magnetic Monster, would be an excellent experimental assistant. Who knows, it might be a little genius. He thought of a certain Pokémon called Tolome. Little Magnetic Monster, with the Surekill skill, Analyze, might be able to be a substitute for Tolome. Of course, this Little Magnetic Monster still needed Gluttony 2 to obtain the Surekill skill, Analyze. This Surekill skill that could not be maintained in a normal state had limited meaning. However, this Little Magnetic Monster was a golem. Since Gluttony 2 had already proven that it could obtain the Analyze ability, then as long as Little Magnetic Monster, as software, hardware, and other aspects were adjusted and upgraded, it would be able to obtain the Analyze ability. It's not a big problem. Dake still had some confidence in his alchemy talent. He then sat back at the table, bent over the table to record, and waited patiently. It was not until 15 minutes later that Curse Cage, Little magnetic monster recovered from the effects of gluttony and no longer ran around like a headless fly. Dake habitually checked its magic card again to confirm the changes in the value. Then he suddenly realized that the analyze in the sure kill skill column was still there. A moment later, he was pleasantly surprised to realize that this analyze should have been generated after Little Magnetic Monster's spiritual intelligence was activated. It had nothing to do with gluttony too. Perfect. Dake immediately summoned Little Magnetic Monster to his side and tested its intelligence with meow meow. Then he quickly confirmed that this Little Magnetic Monster's ability to receive and analyze information was extremely strong. Although it was not as good as a computer for the time being, it already had the appearance of a normal computer when calculating addition and subtraction. As for why it only had addition and subtraction instead of multiplication and division, of course it was because it had not mastered it yet. However, to be able to master addition and subtraction within 10 minutes after it was born, it was obviously extremely terrifying. This Little Magnetic Monster's future was limitless. Dake held it in his palm and stared at it, but there were already more associations in his mind. He did not expect to create more little magnetic monsters with spiritual intelligence. After all, it had been verified before that the same type of magic fairy he had could only activate one spiritual intelligence. However, what if this little magnetic monster could use electromagnetic waves to control other little magnetic monsters? If he used multiple little magnetic monsters to build a specific circuit, would it be able to increase its analysis and calculation ability? Using this method, would it be able to accumulate a super high calculation ability like the clones of Beep 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 Beep? After all, there was a limit to human strength. Dake still had some understanding of his own intelligence. He knew that he was smarter than the average person. In short, he was not that smart. He could not be compared to those famous geniuses with high intelligence in history. However, what if he could build a super brain? Thinking of this, Dake looked at Little Magnetic Monster with a burning gaze. After a while, he placed Little Magnetic Monster on the table. In his mind, he was already thinking about how to upgrade its hardware. In the process of creating this magic golem, he had actually come up with many ideas. Among them, the most basic ideas could not be two. One was to upgrade the basic hardware of Little Magnetic Monster so that it could obtain stronger magic, attack and defense. The second was to upgrade the internal circuit of Little Magnetic Monster so that it could obtain stronger discharge abilities. The first type was actually easier to improve, but it required higher quality materials. Although the second was more difficult, it was only possible after reaching a certain bottleneck. With Little Magnetic Monster's current level, Dake still had the ability to upgrade it further. If he temporarily put the idea of upgrading the magic golem aside and changed it to upgrading the Pokémon, there was also a very obvious path. The next evolution of Little Magnetic Monster was called 3-in-1 Magnetic Monster. As the name suggested, it was a Pokémon born after 3 little magnetic monsters were combined into one. Therefore, according to this idea, he needed to create 2 more little magnetic monsters to conduct experiments. At the same time, he could use this to verify the feasibility of the Super Brain plan. However, the problem with this path was that it was not easy to find a Thunder Beast's eye that could mutate the steel attribute. Therefore, not to mention creating 2 more little magnetic monsters, even creating 1 more little magnetic monster would be very difficult. Let's go to Traveler's Street tomorrow. If I really can't find a Thunder Beast's eye with the steel attribute, then I can only think of a way to change it to a less rare core. Dake shook his head and prepared to strike while the iron was hot. He would start by upgrading the internal circuit. However, just as he was about to do it, the devil that corrupted the will of men came. On the last night before the Christmas ball, Aurora, who still had not been able to hand over her invitation to the ball, came again with freshly made turtle soup. Dake drank a bowl of turtle soup and could not help but think of the garlic turtle. Oh, the garlic turtle. He had always had a faint obsession with the first generation of Pokémon. Charmander, Wonderful Frog and Jenny Turtle, as well as the fourth of the three Pikachu. He had always wanted to create them, but unfortunately, he had not been able to fulfill his dream. After calming down, Dake chatted with Aurora about the Freedom City. As they chatted, Aurora was sent out of the door again. Aurora, who returned to the dormitory with an empty tray, looked at the invitation to the ball, in her hand with an indifferent expression. Dake Dimming, on the other hand, had already started his little magnetic monster upgrade. It was not until nighttime that he finally succeeded in upgrading. Refresh later. Dake Dimming, on the other hand, had already started his little magnetic monster upgrade. It was not until nighttime that he finally succeeded in upgrading. Dake Dimming, on the other hand, had already started his little magnetic monster upgrade. It was not until nighttime that he finally succeeded in upgrading. DD. Chapter 739. The electromagnetic cannon was originally a weapon that used the ampere force generated by the electromagnetic field in the electromagnetic system to accelerate the metal cannonball and fire it. However, Little Magnetic Monster's ultimate skill, the electromagnetic cannon, was different. Electromagnetic cannon. Little Magnetic Monster condenses electricity and fires a cannon-like electric current to attack. It can paralyze the target. To put it simply, the Little Magnetic Monster's electromagnetic cannon was just a kind of electric magic cannon. However, its power was much greater than discharge, and it had a 100% chance of paralyzing the target, unless the target had the corresponding immunity. Little Magnetic Monster's electromagnetic cannon was basically a magic-type skill. However, the original concept of the electromagnetic cannon was physical damage. However, since Little Magnetic Monster had the foundation to control a powerful discharge ability, and also had a strong analyze ability, it was only a matter of time before it could master the real electromagnetic cannon. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, but Dake was still excited. He injected magic into Spell Cage, Little Magnetic Monster, and looked at it carefully. Website. https://m. But can't you? VIP card name, Little Magnetic Monster. Type, Elf card. Level, *****. Race, Machine attribute, Electric/Steel. Magic, 1100 attack, 1400 defense, 500 ultimate skills. Analyze discharge electromagnetic cannon. Magic increased by 100, attack increased by 200, and a new ultimate skill, electromagnetic cannon. However, my defense decreased by 100. I remember that Little Magnetic Monster's electromagnetic cannon only has a 50% hit rate. If I want to strengthen it, I'm afraid I'll have to add a lock function. And if I want to master the real electromagnetic cannon, I'll have to work on electromagnetic wave. As it was too late, Dake gave up the idea of testing the electromagnetic cannon immediately. He picked up a pen and wrote down his thoughts one by one, preparing to implement them one by one when he was free. For a researcher with many ideas, time was indeed the biggest enemy. After washing up and going to bed, Dake held Little Magnetic Monster in his hands and looked around. Little Magnetic Monster's big eyes moved according to his position, but it was still staring at his eyes. Look again, I'll eat you up. Dake couldn't help but think of this advertising slogan. Then he freed his hand and scratched the chin of Little Magnetic Monster. It was hard and cold to the touch, but Little Magnetic Monster was extremely sensitive. It narrowed its eyes into the shape of crescent moons, and the horseshoe-shaped magnet that was not caught spun back and forth, making a screeching sound. After playing with it for a while, tiredness crept into his heart. Dake put Little Magnetic Monster on the bed and crawled under the blanket. The winter was cold. Fortunately, there was always someone at home to warm his bed. Every time he entered, he would feel warm. Me, Little Magnetic Monster, who was lying on the bed, looked at the familiar ceiling and slowly closed his eyes. Magic statues didn't have the problem of how long they could last, but they would also enter a dormant state due to insufficient magic power. That was why they needed to eat. Usually, magic statues ate all kinds of minerals that were rich in magic power, but different magic statues had different diets. Eating randomly would cause irreversible damage to the magic statue's body. High-level magic statues could usually absorb the elements in the air, but the absorption speed was usually very slow. They needed the help of various magic circles and resources. Otherwise, they would generally need a long dormant period to recover their magic power. Some more special magic statues could absorb certain substances and convert them into magic power. Although Dake hadn't tested Little Magnetic Monster, in this aspect he was more or less sure that it could be charged. It wasn't difficult to make a generator with the current magic technology, but this technological route hadn't been developed yet. Even some magisters who were good at using electricity mostly used bioelectricity. They would raise electric magic beasts to generate electricity. Bioelectricity was the main axis of the current technology. Therefore, the right choice for the current era was to equip Little Magnetic Monster with a magic beast that could generate electricity, or a magical animal. At the thought of magical animals, Dake suddenly realized that it had been a long time since he went to the mysterious realm to look for magical animals. However, the number of magical animals in the society was gradually increasing. In short, plans often couldn't keep up with changes. This was something that couldn't be helped. 24th of December. As the temperature plummeted, ice crystals hung from the eaves of the castle. Thin sheets of ice formed on the surface of the lake, reflecting the soft light of the rising sun and emitting a faint orange color. The students who had changed into their winter clothes early walked out of the castle and strolled by the lake, their faces filled with faint anticipation. At 6:30 in the morning, Dake opened his eyes and got out of bed, full of energy. Although he had only slept in the wee hours of the previous night, he had unexpectedly slept very deeply. A mere 4 hours of sleep seemed to be equivalent to 8 hours of normal sleep. He didn't feel any soreness at the corners of his eyes. Instead, he felt comfortable all over. He wore plush pajamas and walked to the balcony. He opened the window slightly and felt the coolness of the cold wind blowing in. He couldn't help but squint his eyes and look out the window. Little Magnetic Monster, with its steel body, wasn't affected by the cold wind at all. It floated on his right shoulder and spun its magnet. Ivan, Son Ivan, and the shape-shifting monsters that had transformed into Son Ivan all opened their sleepy eyes and clustered around his feet. It looked like the years had passed peacefully. Time really flies. Dake looked around and sighed in his heart. It's already the second Christmas. Another year had passed since he suddenly recovered his memories on the stage of the Academy ceremony. As the veil of the unknown unraveled in front of him, the novelty of arriving for the first time gradually faded away. He became more and more integrated into this world. In the distance, a small red dot entered his field of vision and quickly approached. The little fiend monster, wearing a red Christmas hat and a beloved scarf, flapped its wings and flew over. When it got close, Dake opened the window even faster. He raised his hands and caught the basket that it brought from the cafeteria. Day after day, the basket had changed several times. Although Dake had suggested using an insulated lunchbox, the little fiend monster still preferred the basket, so he could only let it be. All this time, Dake had been eating breakfast alone in the dormitory. He had asked the magic guide fairies to go to the cafeteria as much as possible. It had already become a habit. He carried the basket and returned to the room. The window was closed by the little fiend monster. Suddenly, the cold wind disappeared and the chill quickly disappeared. The little magnetic monster circled around the little fiend monster's head, and then flew back to Dake's side. Among the magic guide fairies that lived in the dormitory, it had the best perception of the scabbard. It naturally had a sense of intimacy, but the scabbard only wanted to hang on the Dilu beast's body and completely ignored it, so it seemed a little lonely. However, when it carefully observed the little fiend monster, it found that this black guy looked quite similar to itself. They both had the same round head, so it thought that maybe it could be a good relationship with it. Of course, that was just its imagination. It was a little afraid of strangers. Just then, Meow Meow grabbed it and held it in front of its chest. Then it rubbed its head against the top of its head. Although it didn't feel comfortable, the little magnetic monster still rubbed its head against Meow Meow's palm and showed a fawning expression. On the other side, a few hairy rabbits were surrounding the rabbit grass. They all opened their eyes wide and curiously looked at the pink petals blooming on the rabbit grass head. They twitched their noses and sniffed from time to time. It was quite interesting. Dake took out the newspaper from the basket. The front page of the Great Sage Daily had already turned into a festive red. The headlines were cut in half. One side was the first princess's ingenious idea of holding a Christmas lantern festival in the capital. The other side was the Holy Church's Christmas Massachusetts Christmas Lantern Festival. Dake stretched out his finger and rubbed the picture of the street decorated with lanterns on the newspaper. He couldn't help but recall the Lantern Festival in his previous life. He more or less felt a little melancholy in his heart. However, this melancholy disappeared the moment he opened the Clown Daily. The Clown Daily had also changed its front page to a bright red color, but the first thing that came into view was a clown in a bright red cape. The front page was still filled with all kinds of funny reports, making people laugh. He was in a good mood. After breakfast, he sat down and quietly thought about what he hadn't prepared. Finally, he was sure that everything was in place. He could finally relax completely. He wanted to give himself a break today. But when it came to a break, he didn't know how to rest. At most, he leaned on the deck chair on the balcony and leisurely read books and drink tea. It was the same as Claire. At 8:30, there was a sudden commotion outside the castle. Some voices faintly traveled in. The curious little magical beast flew to the balcony and pulled open the window. The sound waves swept in. Dake stood up and looked over. Someone had summoned a magic fairy above the lake and used a sure-kill skill to thicken the thin layer of ice on the surface of the lake, turning it into a solid layer of ice. Then the students who were waiting by the lake walked onto the ice one by one and started skating. Dake blinked. For a moment he wanted to join in. But when he saw that the crowd was increasing, he had the intention to retreat. Not long after, Deanna and Lucy excitedly knocked on the door and came in. They invited him to play on the lake. Thus, Dake didn't hesitate anymore. He called the magic fairies and left the castle. The professors heard the commotion and came. But they just smiled bitterly and raised their heads. They didn't stop them like they usually did. After all, it was Christmas. Of course, there were also worried professors who quietly walked over and added another layer of insurance to the thick ice. As long as the giant magic fairies didn't jump around randomly, there was no need to worry about the ice breaking. Some sharp-eyed students saw through the professor's trick. 1 spread to 10, 10 spread to 100. Even more students knew that the professors had tacitly agreed to what happened today. Thus they rushed over. When Dake arrived at the lake, the sound of laughter was everywhere. Fortunately, the lake was wide enough. Thus, there wasn't any crowding. He and Lucy walked side by side and followed behind Deanna. After a while, he called Deanna back. Then he used alchemy to create a pair of ice skates with ice blades embedded in them. He performed in front of the two girls. Deanna's eyes lit up. She begged him to quickly make another pair. Dake made 2 pairs and gave one to each of them. Then he taught them how to skate on the ice blades. There were many people skating around, but most of them only had a layer of ice on the bottom of their shoes. There was still a big difference. Deanna didn't need to be taught. Once she stepped on the ice skates, she was even smoother than Dake. However, Lucy's motor skills were very ordinary. With Dake's help, it took her half an hour to stand firm. When she was finally able to stand up, Deanna pouted and asked Dake to teach her. Dake had no choice but to put on an act and deal with her with a dark face. At this time, the surrounding junior magicians had already followed suit. In the blink of an eye, the ice skates with ice blades became popular. After a while, some seniors asked the crowd to move aside. Then, they cleared a track on the lake and started a speed skating competition. Dark even saw the figure of senior sister Winnie Scatty. She actually put down her book and turned into an ice fairy, which was a rare sight. After the speed skating competition started, Deanna gradually couldn't hold back. She stopped pestering Dake and blended into the crowd in the blink of an eye. Dake continued to slowly skate on the lake with Lucy. The sunlight reflected off the ice shone on Lucy's cheeks, reflecting a faint blush. The ice skating craze came and went quickly. After noon, with the sunlight shining on the ice, there were more traces of water on the ice. Only 2 or 3 people were still playing on the ice. and more students, in groups of 3 or 5, poured into Travelers Street. Today's Travelers Street naturally had more and more interesting products and activities than before. Dake originally wanted to go back to his dormitory and have a good rest to prepare for tonight's ball and the more anticipated small experiment. However, he couldn't get rid of Deanna's pestering. He followed them into Travelers Street and then wandered around aimlessly. They didn't have any goal in mind. They just went wherever was lively and had a good time. After this, it wasn't until 3 or 4 in the afternoon that the pedestrians on Travelers Street gradually dispersed. Under Lucy's urging, Deanna was also forced to stop. The 3 of them returned to the castle together. For the girls, from now until midnight, it was wartime. After Dake returned to his dormitory, he took out the dress that he had already prepared from the wardrobe. He first tried it on, then took it off again. He took a bath, washed his hair, and did his hair. The magic guiding fairies also began to follow his example and tidy up their appearance and try on their dresses. Their dresses were all prepared by themselves, so Dake didn't need to worry about them at all. Although they couldn't participate in the evening from the beginning, when it came to the ball, they could freely enter. While the students were looking forward to it, Dake's magic guiding fairies had already been waiting for a long time. In the blink of an eye, it was evening. Asterisk. Chapter 740. The afterglow of the setting sun dyed half of the castle red, and the people's hearts dispelled the cold of winter. The clock on the spiral clock tower was eternally keeping track of time. It was Christmas Eve. With the help of the magical elf, Dark smoothed out the corners of his shirt and put on his bow tie. After thinking for a moment, he threw the rose that was stuck in his chest back into the cup and placed the card bag close to his body. Only then did he relax his brows and try to take 2 steps in the bedroom with a smile. It's time. Go. The moon god's soul, who was sitting on the edge of the bed with the enchanted beast, goddess of the heart, and the enchanted beast, god of destruction, urged Dake to go. The 3 of them had exquisite dresses placed beside them. They were waiting for Dake to go out so that they could try them on. Then I'll go first. See you tonight. Dake waved his hand helplessly and walked out the door with his chest puffed out. Last year he entered the ball hand in hand with Deanna and Lucy, but this year was different. Even if they had to go back to their seats after entering the ball, they still had to show their enthusiasm since they were the ones who invited them to the ball. The 2 of them had already communicated with each other through the door card. They pushed the door open at the same time and walked through the corridor, down the stairs, and met up on the Lover's Bridge. Remember the URL. MVIP, can't you? VIP because of its location. The bridge between the castles had always been popular with couples. Even outside of the holidays, couples would often meet up on the bridge. And on Christmas Eve, there were even more people like this. Male and female students appeared on both sides of the Lover's Bridge, either intentionally or unintentionally. They gathered in the middle of the bridge and left hand in hand. They walked towards the banquet hall on the first floor. When Dake turned from the corridor to the stairs on the 3rd floor of the dorm, the door on the other side opened quietly. Deanna and Lucy, who were dressed to the nines, poked their heads out. Their silky hair cascaded down their shoulders naturally. The 2 of them looked at each other and walked out of the dorm together, closing the door behind them. We're the only ones left tonight, Nana, Lucy said with a sad expression. Just when Deanna was about to say something, her face suddenly changed. She said without mercy, "There's one more." Another pink head popped out from the other side of the corridor. Eudora and Wei didn't harass Dake during the Christmas period, but she obviously didn't have any intention of giving up. She also noticed the 2 people here, so she nodded silently and walked out of the room. A year had passed, and time had left clear traces on her body. Perhaps because she had noticed Dake's experience, she had been growing her hair since the beginning of the year. Now, she finally had a head of beautiful long hair. The 3 girls with different styles gathered at the staircase. They looked friendly on the surface, but at the same time, they were secretly sizing each other up. Deanna's face was still slightly round, but it was obvious that she had a more outstanding beauty temperament. When she closed her mouth, Her eyes under her long eyelashes were as lively as a lake. She, who was already 13 years old this year, finally had a little breakthrough in height. She was taller than Eudora, and it was more obvious. For the Christmas Eve dinner, she chose a different red dress from last year. This fluffy dress, which still had a lot of ruffles, was the color of fire. From her neck to her chest, a large area of whiteness was revealed, and half of her collarbone revealed dimples. Her breasts were stacked on top of each other. This dress that ordinary people couldn't wear at all was just a contrast to her attire. Her skin was as smooth as white jade, and it matched the bright red color very well. Her figure that didn't match her age perfectly supported the curve of her chest. Coupled with the same fiery red rose hair ornament and crystal red dancing shoes, it turned into a dancing flame butterfly. It was enviable. Whether it was Luosi or Eudora, they felt that they couldn't be as dazzling as her. Both of them had chosen to wear lighter colors for the night as well. Luosi was wearing a slightly light blue dress that was different from last year's pure white. The style of the dress was almost the same as Deanna's. She wore a dark blue rose pattern on her head, and the dancing shoes on her feet were dotted with dim stars. Her skin was also white, but her figure was more slender. The cold tone could better set off her temperament. Tonight, she was slightly taller than Deanna. Eudora, on the other hand, was wearing the same light pink dress. Even her lip gloss was extremely light. Walking in the gradually deepening night, there would be a kind of illusion that made people afraid that they would suddenly disappear. But if she stood under the spotlight, she would instantly become the most dazzling existence. But overall, she was still a little delicate. Although her delicate body was easy to push down, if she was too delicate, it would only make people feel more distressed. It was difficult to have other thoughts at the first moment. But this was her strategy tonight. After saving up for so long, she resisted the urge to talk to Dake and send an invitation to the ball. It was as if she had disappeared. It was all for the sake of rushing out at a certain moment tonight, and not giving Dark any chance to react before pulling him onto the stage. If she didn't make a sound, she wouldn't be rejected. Tonight's goal was to dance with her no matter what. The most ideal situation was to take the opportunity to hold her hand. Eudora had been planning for a long time. The three girls, who were already very familiar with each other, walked down the stairs and into the common room. They chose a table and sat down. Then they began to count the time silently, preparing to go out when it was almost time. Soon after, the twin princesses in luxurious clothes sat opposite them. Anna and Anchi, who were wearing complicated ceremonial clothes and gold and silver pendants, were not uncomfortable at all, as if they were wearing casual clothes. The two of them asked about Dake's whereabouts in a roundabout way and ridiculed Deanna vaguely. From time to time, they covered their mouths and chuckled. Deanna gradually pulled a long face, and there was more fierceness in her eyes when she glared at the two little princesses. Luosi hurriedly pressed the back of her hand under the table to prevent her from suddenly pouncing on her and biting her. It wasn't until the two little princesses left under the escort of their fans that Deanna pouted and said, "Annoying." Of course, she wasn't really angry. She was just unhappy. Luosi put her hand under her skirt helplessly and took out a milk candy from the card bag tied to her thigh. After peeling off the candy paper, she stuffed it into Deanna's mouth. Deanna chewed the milk candy, but she was still angry. Eudora, on the other hand, shrank early. She didn't talk to the two little princesses from beginning to end. In short, she lowered her presence to the minimum. After a while, Aurora walked out of the stairs. After catching a glimpse of the three people, she walked over with small steps. She was very familiar with Deanna and Luosi. After arriving at the academy, she often fed Deanna. Luosi naturally accepted her kindness. However, she wasn't very familiar with Eudora, so the two sides made a brief self-introduction after greeting each other. With her unusually keen sense of smell, Aurora immediately realized that the senior in front of her of the same age was also a great threat. However, both sides had only taken half a step forward. In fact, they couldn't be said to be opponents. Eudora was actually also super sensitive. Her feelings were very similar to Aurora's. In short, for defeated dogs, four cats who wanted to steal a fish naturally gathered together. "I wonder how Dake is now," they thought at the same time. Lover's Bridge. Dake, who had just walked to the end of the bridge, found that the bridge was already overcrowded. He decisively took out the door card and prepared to inform Senior Panduola to meet at another place. However, as soon as he moved, he suddenly felt like he was being stared at by a ferocious beast. That feeling was extremely terrifying. It was as if he was already in a bloody mouth. As long as he closed it up and down, he would be crushed by the sharp teeth. It was a feeling that arose in an instant. There was no warning, which was even more terrifying. He trembled all over, and he almost subconsciously turned his head back, trying to see the true face of the beast. Then he felt a slightly cold and soft touch on his lips. Panduola seemed to be frightened, and let out a short scream. Her body, which was leaning forward slightly, instantly straightened up. She covered the side of her face that was quickly turning red with embarrassment. Dake opened his mouth, and his eyes were full of shock. The sense of crisis that was like being stared at by a ferocious beast just now disappeared as if it had never existed. At this time, even if he had already been fooled, he naturally could not say it out loud. Moreover, it was still unclear who had taken advantage of her. Tonight, Panduola Doragon was wearing a black and red lace dress, which was out of the ordinary. Her face, which usually had at most light makeup, had more color on it, making her slightly pale face look even brighter. This was naturally the work of Hephaestus Doragon. Her usual state was to show her paternal lineage. Her long black hair was the standard long and straight black. However, she was different from the slender literary girls with long and straight black hair that often appeared in literary works. Her breadth of mind was so broad that it was difficult to give off the feeling of a literary girl being slender. However, it was the perfect compatibility of these two temperaments that firmly attracted Dake's gaze, and made him unable to look away. Although it was a little embarrassing to say it out loud, Panduola's every point was precisely on his strike zone. Humans were ultimately visual animals before they fell in love with someone. Even after they fell in love with someone, matching their appearance was still a bonus. A cold wind blew, and the flow of people surged. Dake Dimming stood at the end of the bridge, staring at her without blinking. Panduola's cheeks couldn't help but blush when he stared at her without moving. However, before she blushed, she wanted to control the situation. She stammered, "Have you seen enough?" "Not enough," Dake said softly. Then he reached out his white-gloved hand to his dance partner tonight. Panduola also raised her hand and placed her black-veiled hand on his. Their fingers intertwined and gently closed. "Let's go. There's not much time left." The awkwardness of being teased just now was easily overshadowed by her cuteness. Dake Dimming, +1 point. The entrance to the Christmas ball was at 7 o'clock in the evening. However, the students would usually set off from the tower at 6:30, and then enter the castle one after another after strolling around. Luoboat Broheim was like most of the boys. He wore a neat suit, but his broad shoulders and bulging muscles made his suit look too big. He didn't have a cold temperament at all. He suddenly turned around on his way to the tower, and walked towards the only infirmary in the school. On the way, he happened to pass by C. Keat Hurst, who was already a third-year student. He knew that this senior from the Marine Biology Research Department, who had a good relationship with White, should have just come out of the infirmary. Sister Ka Lien was still in the infirmary at this time. Luoboat knocked on the door and entered. After getting Sister Ka Lien's permission, he entered the room. The whisper of conversation that Vogue could hear at the door suddenly disappeared. In the room, there was only Victor, who was half lying down, flipping through a book in boredom. White Gouda was protected in the infirmary with the excuse that he was sick. In order to avoid unnecessary trouble, he could only spend this Christmas in the hospital bed. Think about it carefully. Every holiday is full of misfortune, White said lightly. His eyes were calm as if he had seen through the world of mortals. Robert glared at him and said in amusement, "Stop putting on an act here. The melancholy faction is already outdated." White smiled and said, "Go to the party. Don't worry about me." Luoboat immediately pointed at his suit and said, "Do I look like I'm going to stay here and take care of you?" "Whatever, I see that you're in good spirits, so I won't disturb you." He stood up and rubbed his nose. "I'll come back after the first half." White smiled. Okay, I'll prepare the chessboard. Luoboat nodded and left. He knew about Ophelia Bullard, but he didn't delve into the details. After Luoboat left, Ophelia Bullard reappeared inside. What a good kid. White's mouth twitched, but he didn't refute. In front of adults, even the most mischievous of children would restrain themselves. Of course, he wasn't implying that Luoboat wasn't a good kid. He was just a little impulsive sometimes, stupid, well, pure. But no matter how bad his friend's flaws were, it didn't affect their friendship. At most, he just had to carry the burden. As the clock gradually pointed to 7, the crisp sound of bells rang in the castle. Dake and Panduola walked along the castle's corridor to the banquet hall on the first floor. Neither of them were talkative, but when they were together, they always had endless things to talk about. From the joys and sorrows of the past to the current life, and then to the future. They could talk about as much as they wanted. Regardless of the reason why they had initially fallen in love with each other, they now had a good impression of each other on the basis of that. Time shuttled through thousands of words, and it was 7 o'clock. The two walked through the corridor, down the stairs, and arrived in front of the banquet hall. Through the open door, a huge Christmas tree came into view. It was dazzling. 3 more days. It's time to become an ascetic monk. Chapter 741. A glowing elk stood on both sides of the main entrance of the banquet hall. The elks wore red Christmas hats on their heads. Dake walked to the door and took off the Christmas hat of one of the elks. A new hat spun from the top of its head and landed on the elk's head again. He smiled slightly, turned around, and picked up the Christmas hat. He raised his head slightly and put the Christmas hat on Panduola's head with some caution. With a smile on her face, Pandora also took off a Christmas hat and put it on his head. Their gazes met, and they stood in place for a short while before moving away. Let's go in, Panduola said and hurriedly looked away. Okay. Dake calmly grabbed her hand and walked into the banquet hall. The two of them looked like they were trying to be brave, but in fact, it was their first time in life. They walked into the hall amidst the crisp and pleasant music of the zither. When they entered, their fingers moved gently and naturally released. They said to each other, "See you later." Finally, they walked to the long tables of their respective schools. 1 second to remember https://m. VIP can't you? VIP Panduola's footsteps were obviously faster than usual. Dake paused slightly and looked at her back thoughtfully. Suddenly, he grinned and walked to the long table of the aristocrat compound. Then he met Aurora's gaze. Aurora had obviously left later, but she arrived at the banquet hall first. She was a first-year student, so she naturally sat closest to the door. However, when Dake and Panduola appeared at the door together, she had already caught sight of them. Then, she watched them put on the Christmas hats for each other, and walked into the hall hand in hand. Only then did she quietly withdraw her gaze, but in the end, she couldn't help but look up again. Happy Christmas Eve. Dake waved at Aurora. Aurora suppressed her fluctuating emotions and raised her hand to scratch it. The two of them looked at each other and smiled. Dake walked past him and walked towards the second-year seats. Almost all the second-year students of the aristocrat house had arrived, and there weren't many empty seats left. Dake looked around and saw that there was still a seat left between Deanna and Luosi. However, as soon as he walked in, he noticed that there was a teddy bear holding a lollipop on the seat. His smile froze. Someone's here, Deanna read out in a serious manner. But before Dake could say anything, she couldn't hold it in any longer. She covered her mouth and laughed. That little bear was inexplicably summoned, and then inexplicably returned to the card, leaving the seat empty again. Dake opened his mouth, but he still pulled out a chair and sat down. It was hard to accomplish anything if one was too thin-skinned. But as soon as he sat down, Deanna asked knowingly, "Where have you been?" "Lover's Bridge." Dake said the wrong answer without thinking. Deanna's little face visibly swelled up. She thought that this person was really annoying. He didn't even know how to coax people. But if Dake really lied to coax her, she would be even more unhappy. She couldn't help it. She was unhappy. She was unhappy. She was unhappy. Deanna's lips curled up so much that she could hang a sock on them. Luosi sat on the other side of Dake. It wasn't convenient to feed her now, so she could only blink at Dake. Dake sighed. He had no choice but to move the plate with the whole cake in front of him. He neatly cut it into 3 portions and gave one to Deanna. "Do you want to eat?" "Yes," Deanna replied reflexively and puffed up her cheeks again. But when the cake was placed in front of her, she obediently grabbed a fork and started eating. The atmosphere finally relaxed. Well, it wasn't tense in the first place. This year's Christmas party was still lively. The students were talking and laughing. The desserts and black tea on the table were filled with the aroma. The lively music of the piano drove the cheerful mood. The unlit candlesticks were dancing on the staves. Colorful balls of light were floating in the air, shrinking and expanding from time to time. The 4 long tables were covered with dark red tablecloths. There was a small Christmas tree standing at a certain distance. Under the Christmas tree, there were elk pulling sleds and bags full of gifts, but there was no Santa Claus. On the stage in front of them, there were countless gift boxes and ornaments hanging on the huge Christmas tree. A dazzling golden crown, a magic grimoire that emitted magical light, a shining lance, and a set of tarot cards with the Fool as the first card. The 4 iconic items were floating around the Christmas tree. Glowing elves were dancing around the Christmas tree, and sometimes they would laugh like silver bells. Looking up, the brilliant Milky Way was flowing on the ceiling. Countless stars were twinkling, and it was mysterious in its magnificence. In this infinitely expanding festive atmosphere, the elegantly dressed professors finally came in from the back of the stage and took their seats in the teachers' seats. In Shungmalian Academy, there were staff changes every year. This year, there were a few new faces in the teaching team, and a few old faces were missing. But the students only needed to know the professors of each subject and the deans of each department. Dake looked over there and saw Hephaestus Doragon, but there was no Ophelia Bullard. Professor Ryan Hux, who came after Christmas last year, had blended in well. But for some reason his head, which had regrown long hair, was bald again, and it was rounder than the moon. Professor Lily seemed to be in a good mood. As soon as he sat down, he and Professor Nini began to eat the desserts on the table. Ms. Bella in the library seemed to have a good relationship with Hephaestus. The two sat next to each other, and were whispering to each other. Professor Shi-Erfu sat in the second seat. Tonight, she was wearing a thick coat and a snow-white scarf around her neck. Her face was cold, which was a sharp contrast to Professor Mitya, who was still wearing a thin purple robe. Professor Cheong-si sat in the back, and on her other side was Professor Halder Boyd, who had a gloomy face. Professor Thompson, Professor Eric, Professor Bacon, Professor Stephen Harvey. Almost all the professors that could be thought of were here, except for Kazair. Principal A. Erdii, are you going to be last again? Luosi whispered in Dake's ear. Probably. Dake frowned slightly, but he didn't know what to say. These days, although he was focused on making golems, he was not oblivious to what was happening outside. It was a little different from what was planned. Although Professor Shi-Erfu made a long-distance report to the principal of A. Erdii, it seemed that he didn't get any constructive advice. This was related to the fact that the principal of A. Erdii wasn't actually in the school. There was a limit to what the doppelganger could do. In this incident, the Duke's Mansion and the Shungmalian Academy had reached a private alliance agreement. Olga and Eve would be the representatives of the Duke's Mansion and cooperate with the Academy until the end of this time. Because of this, the Duke's Mansion also got to share some secret information. For example, Dake had always been curious about the whereabouts of the principal of A. Erdii. In short, she was indeed not in the Academy. The last time she was in the Academy was when the professors found the Heart of God in the underground city. At that time, she went to the underground city with Professor Kazair and saw the Heart of God with her own eyes. Not long after, she left the Academy again, and her destination was the Star Tower. The Star Tower was known as the Holy Land of Astrologers and the Land of Stars. Before the appearance of the Sky City, it was also known as the highest place. Regardless of these titles, the Star Tower was the gathering place of the best astrologers in the world. The current master of the Star Tower was one of the most authoritative figures in astrology. Compared to her, Professor Mitya Bartholomew was slightly inferior. In order to see the future clearly, the principal of Aertii personally went to the Star Tower to visit the master of the Star Tower, and the result was self-evident. After that, the Shungmalian Academy started the project against God. Professor Ka Zayer's small experiment was part of the project against God, but it was added after considering Professor Ka Zayer's personal wishes. The underground city of Shungmalian Academy was an inseparable part of the Academy's facilities. In principle, the Academy didn't want to risk experiments inside, and they didn't want to mix the secret passage and God together, because no one could predict what would happen. In short, the principal of Aertii was more willing to put the risk outside, and only bring it back when it was safe. Therefore, the real project against God was led by her and carried out by herself. Under the guidance of the master of the Star Tower, she set off towards the north. There was the once collapsed mountain of the gods, Mount Pelopos. The so-called Mount Pelopos was basically the name of Mount Olympus in the original game. It was the extreme point of light, the entrance to heaven, and the place where the gods ruled. Even among the gods, the Empyrean gods were the noblest of them all. Considering that the gods were about to recover, the principal of Aertii originally planned to explore the mountain of the gods, Mount Pelopos, and the land of the fallen gods' silent plains. However, the master of the Star Tower helped her make the choice. The information sharing stopped here. Although Dake really wanted to know why the principal of Aertii wanted to go to Mount Pelopos, what she found in Mount Pelopos, and how far the exploration in Mount Pelopos had progressed. These were all top-secret information, and even Professor Li, one of the deans of the 4 major departments, didn't know. In short, the principal of Aertii probably wouldn't be able to rush back in a short time. Regarding her exploration in Mount Pelopos, if it wasn't a breakthrough, then it was an unprecedented predicament. Professor Shi-Erfa didn't mention a word, and others couldn't guess. Therefore, at tonight's Christmas party, it was likely that the principal of Aertii's clone could only appear. As for whether her clone was considered principal of Aertii, for the majority of students who didn't know, perhaps it was. Duong. Not long after the professors took their seats, the 7 o'clock bell rang from the direction of the spiral clock tower. The first-year students looked curiously in the direction of the bell, while the students of the higher years were already prepared. The lights in the entire auditorium were instantly extinguished after the bell rang. The light disappeared, and the darkness was terrifying, and the panic was naturally only limited to the first-year students. There was such a scene at the Christmas party every year. Who knew which professor's bad taste came from? Dake squinted slightly and silently counted to 3. He saw the silver candlesticks floating in the air light up together. The halos of the candles instantly connected, illuminating the entire auditorium. Light and shadow quickly intertwined. The atmosphere of the Shungmalian Academy's banquet gradually emerged. The desserts and tea on the table silently disappeared, and rows of gold and silver cutlery quietly appeared. The light of the candles shone on the gold and silver cutlery, refracting a faint colorful light. The most beautiful and noble lady of the Shungmalian Academy, Cynthia St. Aertii, quietly appeared on the stage while the students' attention was attracted by the cutlery on the table. She raised her staff and gently waved it. The cries of elk suddenly sounded from afar, and then quickly approached. The sky lit up with bright stars. The starlight only arrived after the sound was heard. The snow-white reindeer pulling the sleigh ran out of the starlight, and a bearded Santa Claus sat on the sleigh. The bottom of the gift bag on his back had starlight flowing out, forming a long tail. It appeared from the other side of the stage, and circled around the spacious auditorium. Then, it knocked open the door amidst the cries of the elk, and disappeared into the night with a long tail. The stars flowing from the bottom of the gift bag sprinkled on the plates, and turned into countless delicacies. This was Santa Claus's gift, the source of tonight's joy. Among the countless delicacies, in front of almost everyone, there was a fat and tender turkey with rich meat. The turkey's belly was facing up, and the fragrant ingredients overflowed from the incision on its belly. The turkey's grease on the surface of the turkey slid onto the plates, making people drool. The excited students couldn't help but pick up their knives and forks. eager to enjoy the delicious food that only came once a year. Today is Christmas Eve. Principal Aerdi's voice sounded. It's a day to reunite with your family. But for me, Shengmalian is my home. Every student here is my family, Wang Chong said. Every Christmas Eve, I will make a wish that I can spend the next Christmas Eve with my family. It seems that my wish from last year has come true again. Sure enough, it's a wish that is made every Christmas Eve. It's exactly the same as last year's speech. Dake picked up his knife and fork, and silently complained. There were many people in the auditorium who had the same thought as him, but they all tacitly stayed silent. Because Principal Aerdi's speech was about to come to an end. Why did he have to go to the trouble of exposing her? The children of Shengmalian Academy were always so gentle. I wish you all a peaceful Christmas Eve. No matter when or where, peace will be with you, my dear family. Principal Aerdi opened his arms, as if he wanted to embrace the entire academy, and gave the final speech. Then, the piano in the corner of the stage played automatically, and tonight's Christmas banquet began as usual. The students could finally pick up their knives and forks, and eat heartily. Dake paid attention to the growth of gluttony, while enjoying the delicious taste of the turkey. From time to time, he would fill Deanna's glass with juice, so that she wouldn't choke because she ate too quickly. Dinner lasted for almost half an hour, and finally, the stage was ready for the performance. Last year, the opening was a magic circus, followed by the surprise appearance of the famous singer, the mermaid Miss Seymour, and then the ballet, Swan Lake. The wonderful Swan Lake left a deep impression on the audience, and they could still remember it clearly even today. Dake looked at the stage with slight anticipation. He knew that this year's opening performance was a dance drama, The Green-Eyed Girl, which was produced by the National Duel Club. This dance drama was written for the purpose of selling cards, and it was being performed at various parties in the kingdom at almost the same time. The club had put in a lot of effort to advertise it all over the country. The main character of the dance drama was based on the hippocampus people, and it included elements of a simulated duel. However, it didn't involve the specific rules of a simulated duel, and the duels in the dance drama were mostly about showing off the powerful elves. The first half of the dance drama was about the main character's persistence and restraint towards the green-eyed white dragon card. The second half of the dance drama was about the green eyes turning into a human, and it depicted a touching love story. Although the dance drama wasn't as perfect as Swan Lake, it was still a new show that had never been seen before, and the audience, who were tired of watching old shows, couldn't stop praising it. Dake watched the entire dance drama without blinking, and he knew that the National Duel Club's marketing was in the bag. After the performance of The Green-Eyed Girl, the stage returned to normal, and it was time for the ball. 9:00 p.m. sharp. The highly anticipated first half of the Christmas ball had begun. Wow! Deanna bit off the bone of the lamb chop and swallowed it whole. She looked at the person next to her like a thief. Dake shook his head and wiped the grease off the corner of her mouth with a wet towel. Then he whispered, "I'm leaving now. See you in the second half." "Oh," Deanna replied and continued to eat. She almost buried her whole face into the small mountain of lamb chop. Her cheeks were red, and it spread to her ears, as if she was on fire. Dake stood up silently. Luosi moved over and sat next to Deanna. He winked at Dake and said, "Mine." Dark smiled, then raised his head to look in the direction of the 5th grade. Panduola Doragon put down the mouthwash and pushed away the chair under everyone's gaze. She stood up gracefully. Even though she was surrounded by everyone's formal attire, she was still the most dazzling flower. The two of them no longer hid their intimacy. The 5th grade students already knew that this white dragon girl, who was once known as the Iron Wall of the Ball, had already been conquered by this little junior. At last year's Christmas ball, it was these two who stepped on the stage and opened the curtains for the ball. Some people were unhappy about this and cursed in their hearts about Shotai-kan. They looked at Panduola with eyes full of jealousy. They wished that they were the Shotai-kan. However, Dake Deming was already 13 years old. During the war, he was considered an adult at the age of 14. He was already old enough to step onto the battlefield. Although his body was not fully grown yet, he was already more than one. 7 meters tall. He could be considered as a part of a Shota. Perhaps the only thing left was his young and handsome face. Not long after, the golden boy and jade girl met up below the stage. Panduola turned her head and looked at the young man whose shoulders were now at the same level as her. She could not help but smile from the bottom of her heart. Last year he was not this tall. She did not expect that in just 1 or 2 years, he would catch up to her. However, she was a mixed-blood dragon after all. Her puberty period was longer than that of a normal person. There was still room for growth in the next few years. The more she thought about it, the happier she became. Female dragons would not yield to people who were weaker than them. She believed that Dake would surpass her one day, whether it was in height or other aspects. When that time came, a faint blush appeared on Panduola's cheeks. Her shyness made everyone envious. Hey! Dake was staring at the senior's face with rapt attention. Suddenly, there was a loud shout beside him. He frowned and turned around. He saw Anna and Enchi, who he could not tell who was who, squinting at him like a pair of perverted eyes. "Good evening, Dake," said Anna. "Good evening, Dake," said Enchi. The two little princesses' voices were obviously up to no good. Dake sighed in his heart. He turned around and bowed. "Good evening, my lovely princesses. Your faces are as bright as the stars, and your hearts are as deep as the Milky Way. Thank you." Anna smiled. "Are you calling me evil?" And she stepped on Dake's foot. Dake pulled his foot back and stepped on her foot. He looked down at her and said, "All right, and she. Happy Christmas Eve. I prepared a Christmas present for you." "Ha. Of course, I prepared something for you too." And she's eyes widened. Her face was red with anger. "Then I'm looking forward to it." Dake smiled. He held Panduola's arm and stepped onto the stage. And she immediately pulled her foot back and looked at Anna. The twin princesses nodded in tacit understanding and walked onto the stage. As they walked, their lips moved, and the magic cards hidden in their sleeves lit up, and a faint aura enveloped their bodies. The two of them had been planning for this day for a long time. Dake and Panduola attracted a lot of attention, but the twin princesses were not inferior. As the accompaniment started, Dake and Panduola started to dance. The two little princesses did the same. 6,000 chapters. Last 2 days, begging for monthly votes. Don't let the monthly votes and blades expire in your bag. 6,000 chapters. Last 2 days, begging for monthly votes. Don't let the monthly votes and blades expire in your bag. 6,000 chapters. Last 2 days, begging for monthly votes. Don't let the monthly votes and blades expire in your bag. 6,000 chapters. Last 2 days, begging for monthly votes. Don't let the monthly votes and blades expire in your bag. 6,000 chapters. Last 2 days, begging for monthly votes. Don't let the monthly votes and blades expire in your bag. Chapter 742. What's going on? Why didn't it work on him again? Anna and Enchi whispered as they danced in circles. They didn't do much. They just made 2 magic cards that could make people feel dizzy. They wanted to mess up Dake's dance and embarrass him. Originally, they had succeeded the first time, and the two of them were quite happy. But after that, they didn't succeed again, and their smiles gradually disappeared. Anna couldn't help but say angrily, "Damn it, are we too kind? If we knew that his mental fortitude was so strong, we would have made him a mental fortitude hammer." And she complained, "Don't be like that. We still have to stay in this lousy academy for 5.5 years. "That's true." Anna sighed. People had to lower their heads when they were under someone else's roof. Dake was considered half a professor in this academy. They were quite clear about the current situation. At most, they would try to touch the tiger's skin, but they wouldn't dare to touch the tiger's balls. If it weren't for the fact that a certain someone didn't even take the initiative to invite the princesses to dance with him, they wouldn't have hurried over to make this magic card as revenge. Damn it, since the conspiracy didn't work out, we can't do it openly. And she rolled her eyes and said, "I think that senior sister White Dragon's dance steps are still stiff. She probably doesn't dance often. How about we work a little harder and suppress her?" "That's right, steal her limelight." Anna's eyes lit up. She said cheerfully, "It's time to show them what real dancing skills are." The two little princesses instantly reached an agreement. Then their temperaments changed, and they started to dance magnificently on the stage. As princesses, they had been learning all kinds of banquet skills since they were young. Of course, their dancing skills were far superior to Dake and Panduola. Therefore, their strategy wasn't wrong at all. What was wrong was that they were going in the wrong direction. Dake didn't want to attract attention at all. So what if they stole his limelight? It could even be said that he would be happier if they could draw all the attention away from him. In that case, he would be able to immerse himself in the world of two people with Panduola. After that, one song after another, the crowd on the stage changed again and again. Anna and Angie relied on their exquisite dancing skills to attract the attention of the crowd like a whirlpool. They quickly occupied the center of the stage and became the brightest stars under the spotlight. However, they did not realize that the two of them had become powerful assistants. When Dake saw the two idiots walking further and further away, he brought Panduola over to the huge Christmas tree. Then he slowly danced under the Christmas tree, fully enjoying this rare opportunity. This dance lasted for more than half an hour. The two of them were so immersed in each other's gazes that they did not notice the passage of time. However, the music stopped. Although it was only a short break, it allowed the young man and woman who were still unsatisfied to finally regain their senses. Then they smiled at each other and walked off the stage. "He's finally gone." On the other side, Anna and Anchi, who were as tired as dogs, stuck out their tongues and quickly let go of their hands and walked off the stage from the other side. They probably didn't want to dance for a long time. However, the two little princesses' best performance did add a lot of color to tonight's dance. The surrounding teachers and students who were dancing also had a lot of fun. Of course, there were also some little cuties mixed in with the crowd, twisting their butts and spinning in circles. The first half of the dance was from 9 to 10 o'clock. After that, the second half would start at 11 o'clock. Dark's magic elves had sneaked in as early as 7:30 p.m. and sat at the entrance to watch the entire program. After 9 o'clock p.m., they entered openly and blended in with the crowd, not appearing out of place at all. The teachers and students of Shungmalian Academy had long been used to their presence. Many people were even familiar with them and had a very close relationship with them. Some people fed Snorlax monthly votes, some people invited the demon fox to dance, and some people fought to hug the pink furry rabbit that was hugging the tree stump. Well, fairy tale animal Little Rabbit became the most popular magic elves tonight. There were also many magic elves who were eager to jump to their master's side. However, Dake told them not to disturb them. At least during the first half of the dance, they had to give them some face. Only then did they get precious private space. But in short, the little cuties who received Christmas hats from the elk at the door had a good time. Tonight's banquet would definitely become a beautiful memory in their hearts. And their master, Dake Dimming, walked out of the banquet hall together with Senior Panduola after coming down from the stage. However, they had been dancing for more than half an hour. The nearby place suitable for the two of them to be alone had already been occupied. Even the stone bench that they sat on last year was already occupied. The two of them smiled helplessly and walked further and further away. Slowly, they walked out of the castle and came to the edge of the lake that had already thawed. The curtain of night fell slightly, and the stars were shining along the lake like the Milky Way. However, the wind blowing against their faces was a little cold. It kept them awake at all times and made them unable to immerse themselves in the charming atmosphere. Unknowingly, the two of them walked into the pavilion in the middle of the lake and sat down by the pavilion. The wind quieted down. The young man and young woman's shoulders gradually moved closer to each other. And just like that, there was no more sound. The night was very cold, but people's hearts were always warm. The view of the two of them was pulled away, and their backs were hidden in the darkness. At 10 o'clock sharp, the bell rang and the song ended. "The first half is over," Dake said softly. Panduola replied lazily, Dake hesitated slightly, but still said, "I prepared a gift." Panduola said, "For Christmas Eve?" Dake said, "For Christmas Day." Panduola said, "Can't there be two?" Dake. Panduola suddenly laughed softly. Alright, I was joking. I also prepared a gift. Let's exchange? Dake nodded. Okay. The two of them separated slightly and sat upright. Then, they each took out a gift and placed it on each other's knees. Dake lowered his head slightly and picked up Panduola's Christmas gift. It was a square gift box wrapped in beautiful colored paper. It was a little heavy, but it wasn't heavy. Dake guessed what it would be, and a faint smile appeared on his face. As for the Christmas gift he gave Panduola, although it was also wrapped in colored paper, it was a flat rectangular gift box. Inside, of course, was the magic card that he had meticulously made. Compared to last year's Christmas gift, this magic card wasn't considered precious at all. But the effort he had put into it was 100 times, no, 1,000 times more than last year's gift. Can I open it now? Dake asked softly. Panduola's eyes flickered, but she said matter-of-factly, since it's a Christmas gift, of course it has to be opened after Christmas. Dake could only suppress the restlessness in his heart, and holding the gift box he said, then wait until after midnight. Although last year's Christmas gift was opened during the dance, the situation was special at that time, so he didn't bring it out to talk about it. Panduola looked at the gift box he gave her and said softly, there are still 2 hours before it can be opened. Dake was a little tempted. How about we? Panduola said firmly, no, let's wait. Dake smiled and put away the gift box. Then the two of them quietly leaned against each other, carefully savoring the passing of time. It was as if the world was alive as long as the other was by their side. On the other side, Deanna was fighting with Snorlax for food in the name of conserving energy. Well, it wasn't that bad, after all. There was a lot of delicious food in the banquet hall, and they couldn't finish it all. Luosi was sitting beside her, and she was also devouring the strawberry cake in front of her little by little. This was the 3rd piece of strawberry cake that she had eaten tonight. And it was already an exception among exceptions. All this time, she had been trying her best to maintain a slender figure. People like Diana, who would never gain weight no matter how much she ate, and whose flesh would only grow where it should, would never understand the hardships of ordinary girls like her. She sighed slightly, and put the last strawberry into her mouth. She resisted the desire to continue eating with her strong willpower, and changed the topic. I don't know what Dake and Doragon are doing now. The words that came out of his mouth made Diana's hand that was holding the knife and fork suddenly stop. Then, as if she was trying to forcefully convince herself, she repeatedly muttered, slowly, slowly, slowly. Pfft. Luosi couldn't help but laugh. The so-called slowly was actually a plan that she and Deanna had made together. But plans always couldn't keep up with changes. Once Dake and Panduola's relationship really came to fruition, their plan would be stranded halfway, and they wouldn't be able to proceed at all. The only thing they could rely on was Dake Diming's self-control. Fortunately, Dake's self-control was supported by Bliss, and he had been performing well all this time. Luosi said, after this year, Panduola will be in the 6th grade. Then in another year, she will graduate and leave school. At that time, your chance will come. But that will still take a long time. Deanna muttered as she swallowed the food in her mouth. She actually preferred to fight head-on. Of course, the premise was that she had a chance of winning. Luosi comforted her. During this period, you should work harder and grow a little taller. Deanna glanced at her and said angrily, you're so annoying. You're poking at my sore spot again. Luosi laughed. Uncle and Auntie are already so tall, so you'll definitely grow taller too. Maybe one day, you'll suddenly be taller than me. I have to grow taller sooner or later, Deanna said. Otherwise I'll be treated like a child again. So, I have to work harder to eat. The more I eat, the faster I grow. Luosi. Deanna started eating again. When they saw Dake's figure again, it was already the beginning of the second half of the dance. Panduola walked beside Dake, keeping a little distance between them. Then she watched him walk quickly to the long table of the aristocrat courtyard, and her smile disappeared. She knew that Dake was going to dance with Deanna again. Last year, Dake also left the second half of the dance for Deanna. Their relationship must be very good. Of course, she could understand. But this time was different from the past, and she was starting to feel a little jealous. But things had already come to this, so she quickly smiled again and slowly followed behind. After being reminded by Luo-si, Deanna quickly rinsed her mouth, wiped the corners of her mouth, and stood up shyly. She was not usually like this, but tonight for some reason, she felt very, very shy. Go quickly. Luo-si pushed her quietly from behind. She quickly walked over, but when she stood in front of Dake, she did not know what to say. She just looked hesitant. A hand with a white glove appeared in front of her eyes. And then Dake's voice came. This lovely lady, may I have the honor of dancing with you? Of course. Deanna nodded hard, raised her hand, and put it in Dake's palm. Dake took her hand and walked to the stage. As they walked, the clock struck 11 o'clock on time, and the second half of the dance began with the sudden sound of the zither. Pairs of men and women in exquisite gowns stepped onto the stage again. The professors, who had left the first half of the dance to the students, also left the stage to enjoy their lost youth. Before Dake stepped onto the stage, he was blocked. Panduola was a distance behind, and she could not help but smile. At this time, she should be more jealous, but when she thought of Dake's embarrassment, she really wanted to laugh. In front of the stage, Victoria was holding Phoenix's hand and standing there like a door god. Moon God's soul, magical beast, goddess of the heart, and magical beast, god of destruction were 2 meters away, whispering to each other. Fairy Ibu, Death Coffin, Demon Fox, Diru Beast were leaning against the wall. They were all magic elves. But of course, she knew that these magic elves had intelligence close to that of humans. They were definitely not waiting there just to block the way. She turned her gaze, and saw a few other girls who were not at the stairs of the stage, but were also eyeing the stage covetously. These girls purposely avoided the first half, but at the same time, they were aiming for the second half. But they probably did not expect that they would have so many competitors, right? Panduola's gaze turned, and she remembered what Dake had said before. What did he say to me outside? That he had something to do tonight, so he would leave early? After saying that, he didn't tell me what it was. Now he's in trouble, right? After this round, can he still leave early? What should I do? Panduola smiled foolishly, but she realized that the girl with light blonde hair had already walked to her side. Why are you standing here? She asked. Luo-si walked over and wanted to greet her, but at this moment his expression froze. Panduola exhaled. Shouldn't you be over there? It's the last day of the month, please vote. My head was smashed by the crab pincers. Save me. Chapter 743. Aren't you supposed to be over there? This sentence drilled into Luo-si's ears like a shuttle. She was instantly stunned. She felt a buzzing sound in her head, and she was stunned. Her current state of mind was like a little rabbit that had been pulled out of a dark hole, or a kitten that had been caught stealing dried fish. She wanted nothing more than to curl up into a ball. However, Panduola was a little surprised when she saw her reaction. She thought to herself, "You're so obvious. Don't tell me you think you're hiding it very well?" Fortunately, her temper had improved a lot after she reunited with Hephaestus, so she didn't expose her too much. Thus she added, "But that's good too. Sitting on the mountain and watching the tigers fight is indeed not a good strategy." Luo-si's head exploded. She immediately came to her senses and hurriedly explained, "Senior, I didn't have that thought." Panduola crossed her arms in front of her chest, her delicate ripples trembling. She smiled and said, I understand. Luo-si's rebuttal came to an abrupt end. Her ears were as red as blood. Panduola took advantage of her stunned state to casually pull her to sit down. She calmly took a brand new tea set from the side, and placed the teacups in front of herself and Luo-si. Then she filled them with a pot of black tea. The fragrance and sweetness of the tea was different from the bitter tea. It seeped into one's heart along with the spiraling green smoke. Remember, https://m, VIP can't you? VIP Panduola pulled out a bunch of fruit plates, cakes, puddings, and cookies from the table. Then she asked Luo-si to eat. Luo-si carefully held the teacup. She was especially cautious. Panduola excitedly pointed at the girls below the stage, who were eyeing them covetously. She asked, "What do you think of them?" Luosi didn't expect her to ask this question. However, due to her guilty conscience after being exposed, she subconsciously followed Panduola's train of thought and said, "Very, very good. What's wrong?" "It's nothing." Pandora chuckled and looked over at her own accord. Those girls were actually very smart, but it was easy to become blind when one fell in love with someone. They knew that they couldn't snatch it in the first half, so they chose to avoid the first half. But he never thought that if he didn't even have the courage to face her head-on, what could he use to fight her? Forget about the girl named Aima. She seemed to have danced with Dake at the Christmas ball last year, but her presence was not strong this year. Panduola thought that she had given up struggling, but he did not expect her to still be so stubborn. But that was it. On the other hand, the girl named Eudora had always kept a low profile, but her contact with Dake had become more frequent. Is she finally going to reveal her fangs today? Speaking of which, Deanna was the most generous. As the saying goes, the pavilion closest to the water enjoys moonlight first. This child usually looked energetic, but when it came to Bayonet, she became timid. Sure enough, her mental age was still too young. It would take a few more years for her to be a threat. Even Aurora, who was 1 year younger than her, was more threatening than her. That was too much. Panduola's smile faded slightly, and her eyebrows were a little dignified. In her opinion, the behavior of these little girls was like a child's game, but Aurora's game was really like a monk's game. Since she got the door card, she often exchanged messages with Dake. Although they rarely met in daily life, the communication time had increased. Therefore, she now knew a lot about Dake's daily situation. Of course, she also knew that Aurora was trying her best to please him every night before feeding him. Although Panduola felt that she had a huge advantage now, she was not very good at getting along with people. It was the first time for her to deal with emotional matters. Her mature appearance could not hide the clumsiness in her heart. Many times she did not know how to deal with it, and could not grasp the importance of it. Therefore, she had never said much about Dake accepting Aurora's feeding. And Aurora was a student of the aristocratic academy, and she was from the Magic Academy. Aurora's actions could be said to be at the right time, the right place, and the right people. At present, it seemed that nothing could stop her. In front. In the end, Dake stood his ground against the opinions of the public. He held Deanna's arm and stepped onto the stage. Between Deanna and the many magic elves, he chose Deanna. It could not be said that the magic elves were not as important as Deanna in his heart, but Deanna had sent him a formal invitation. He had to consider Deanna first. Dake's heart was actually very soft. But when necessary, he could always be tougher than anyone else. Those who were close to him could generally feel that the arrogance and indifference he showed to the outside world was just an act. The softness in his heart made him meticulous, gentle, and elegant. His toughness when necessary made him unusually decisive at critical moments. There was always an indescribable sense of security when being with him. This was where his charm lay. Once someone touched him, they would be firmly attracted to him, and would never be willing to let go. Panduola looked at the stage. Dake and Deanna had already started a circle dance on the stage. Deanna was the same as her. She was not good at dancing, but her athletic ability was extremely strong. She learned to dance very quickly, but she still danced very slowly. It was so slow that it was completely inconsistent with her style. Deanna's mental age was very young. It was normal for her to be attracted to Dake, but it was actually very difficult to say. How much of that feeling was love between a man and a woman, and how much of it was dependence on her father and older brother? Panduola judged from the perspective of a bystander. She thought that it was mostly the latter. So even though Deanna seemed to be the most proactive, she was not a big threat. She was even worse than Luosi Flati, who was beside her. Panduola picked up a cookie and stuffed it into her mouth. She had interacted with Luosi and Deanna last year. At that time, Luosi was far less outgoing than she was now. Luosi was very insecure, just like her when she first came to Shingmalian Academy. And a person like Dake who was gentle, considerate, And Saif was like a huge magnet to girls like her. He had a natural attraction. What's more, both his external and internal conditions were top-notch. If he did not control it, he was simply a living little girl's harvester. In fact, last year's events had already verified this description. Dake received almost all the first-year girls' invitations to the ball. Therefore, it was very reasonable for Luosi to like Dake. On this point, Panduola actually felt the same. She would not like an irresponsible man. Panduola continued to look at the golden-haired young man dancing on the stage. As for the girl dancing with the young man, she no longer had any sense of existence in her eyes. Luosi Flati was still nervous at this moment. She did not know where she had given herself away. She had never thought about the possibility that she was full of flaws. In a situation where she could not figure it out, she could not help but think about the consequences of her thoughts being exposed. Since Panduola had already seen through it, then would Dake know? Would Deanna know? I can't let Deanna know. She did not know why, but this was her first thought. She was even a little flustered. But she did not know what to do. She was just a girl who had spent most of her life in a birdcage. She was an inexperienced girl. What should I do? As the saying goes, when you can see others, others can also see you. Although Ai Ma, Eudora, and Aurora were in different positions, they were actually paying attention to Panduola. Ai Ma's thoughts were actually quite light. She had put on makeup again today. She had learned how to do it herself. What she wanted to do was to wait for Dake to finish dancing and sit down to rest, just like last year. Then she would disturb him a little and dance a simple song. Then they would go their separate ways. But this year, even if she deliberately avoided the first half and avoided Panduola, it would be more difficult to achieve her goal in the second half. Because the people lining up were too. Well, there were even more magic elves lining up. This really messed up her rhythm. She did not know if she should be ahead of the group of magic elves or wait until the magic elves had their fun. Then, she would probably have to wait until the end of the ball, right? Her thoughts, which had always been clear, were slightly messed up. Aima was sure that she was not good at dealing with this kind of thing. Eudora, on the other hand, pursed her lips and stared at Dake without blinking. She felt that she was an assassin. The kind that would flee thousands of miles away if she missed. If she mustered up the courage to rush out tonight, and was rejected again, she was afraid that she would really have to flee thousands of miles away. She heard that the people on the Star Tower all spoke very nicely. Perhaps she should go and take a look. Sad. In short, she was looking for an opportunity now. An opportunity to hit the target with one strike. During this process, she felt that a ferocious beast had been hibernating behind her, which made her hair stand on end. But she withstood the pressure. Good job, Eudora. She cheered herself on and forced herself not to care about the oppressive dragon might. You can do it, Eudora. Aurora's position was slightly behind Eudora and Aima. Before today, she had invaded Dake's dormitory twice with the excuse of delivering supper, but she had failed to hand over the invitation to the ball twice. Of course, it couldn't be because she had forgotten. How could she forget such a thing? It was just that in her heart, there was always some stubbornness and restraint that belonged to a young girl. She hoped that Dake would take the initiative to invite her. So after thinking about it, she didn't make a move on the night of stewing chicken soup. On the second night, she was like a turtle in the end. Her original consideration was that if Dake didn't take the initiative to invite her again, she would compromise, do it herself. However, when it came to the last moment, she stopped again. An idea suddenly emerged in her mind. It was only the second half of the dance. Was there really any meaning to it? Once this idea came out, it was difficult to suppress. She only felt that her plan all along was fake. There was an impenetrable wall between what she wanted and the current situation. The name of the wall was Panduola. Before breaking through this wall, all the sweetness that seemed to be successful was meaningless. It was a poison that corroded the will. A lure that made people learn to compromise. She asked her heart. What did she want? Her heart told her the answer. So in the end, Aurora failed to hand over the carefully prepared invitation to the dance party. Then until now, she was still entangled in the question of whether to go or not. If she went, she always felt like she was rushing to eat the bones thrown by others. If she didn't go, she was afraid that she wouldn't even get the bones. She originally wouldn't be entangled in this kind of problem. But even a girl herself couldn't guess what a girl was thinking for a moment. She was a little obsessed. The whole situation was much more complicated than Dake expected. But the intricate situation gave him a gap. If after dancing with Deanna, Ai Ma, Eudora, Aurora, and Luosi appeared at the same time and surrounded him, he was afraid that it would really be difficult for him to choose. As for the current situation, there was only Deanna in front of him for the time being. It was disrespectful to all girls to think about other girls when dancing with the girl he liked. Therefore, he deliberately restrained his thoughts and immersed himself in dancing with Deanna. He had mastered the rhythm that Deanna liked, and from dancing slowly with her rhythm to leading her to a more intense high position, the two gradually developed more tacit understanding, and Deanna also learned more positions. Deanna even felt that it was no big deal to be able to enjoy it so much just by being wronged for a while. But happy times were always short-lived. The end of the song was relatively abrupt for both of them. Deanna hesitated. She didn't want to stop at all. After summing up the experience of last year, she didn't wear thin high heels to make herself more compatible with Dake. The dark red crystal dancing shoes fit her very well. She didn't feel sore at all, and she didn't have to worry about the high heels being broken. She could continue to dance, like Dake and Panduola, for half an hour, or even a whole hour. But she didn't know that Dake couldn't wait any longer. Professor Ka-Zaire wasn't in the banquet hall since the beginning of the evening party. He had been preparing for tonight's experiment since before the evening party. No, he had been preparing for tonight's experiment since yesterday. The day before yesterday was Sunday, the 22nd, and he returned from the underground city. And since that night, Ollie had disappeared as well. By the way, 2 new maids came that afternoon. However, the 2 maids didn't come for the underworld's fire extraction experiment, but to hand over the goods. Dake had ordered them at the Duke's mansion, and the gifts for the magical elves were also brought over. And tonight, just before the second half of the dance, Dake returned to the banquet hall and found that Professor Shi Erfu had disappeared. In addition, Sister Kalien, Professor Cheongsi, Professor Midi, and Professor Lili were also missing. As for Principal A. Erdei's clone, it had been a long time since he last saw it. Since then, among the professors who sneaked into the underground city together, only the innocent-looking Professor Nini was still squatting there and fighting with Snorlax for food. Foggy. Since then, among the deans of the 4 schools, only the current dean of the House of Fools, the professor who taught magical elemental languages, Professor Holdell Boyd, remained. He sat in the corner behind the teachers' seats, and his eagle-like eyes glanced around the entire hall, as if he was trying to catch 108 murderers in this hall. Fortunately, Professor Nini used her huge body to block his gaze, so he could only see a little from the side. That was why he didn't achieve the achievement of Atmosphere Destroyer. Seeing that all the professors were yo-yos, Dake couldn't calm himself down. Even if he couldn't participate in this small experiment led by Professor Ka-Zaire like the other professors, even if he couldn't get involved in this experiment, he still wanted to see the results of the experiment, the moment when the experiment was successful. Such a precious and great moment. He didn't want to miss it no matter what. He couldn't wait to run to the secret passage, to the experiment site. 11:30. He set a time limit for himself in his mind. He had to finish everything before 11:30. He couldn't delay any longer. Dake. Deanna raised her head, and her cute face, which already had the temperament of a beauty, was slightly raised. She stared at Dake with her shy eyes, and her watery eyes were filled with expectation. Dake's heart was in pain, and his footsteps were already in rhythm with the start of the second dance. Panduola pursed her lips and swallowed the tea in her mouth. She realized that Deanna's threat level had increased by 1. She couldn't cut it and she couldn't sort it out. Being soft was Dake's strength, but it was also his weakness. There were always 2 sides to everything. After all, Deanna came first. She suddenly heard this sentence in her ear. This made the corners of her eyes tighten, but she didn't turn her head to look. Luosi suddenly said this sentence out of nowhere. Was it for her, or for himself? Who knew? No one knew. The atmosphere of Christmas Eve was strange and unpredictable. Every dance on Christmas Eve was shortened to between 5 and 6 minutes. In 30 minutes, there were about 5 dances. When the second dance was about to end, Dake finally adopted the tactic of striking first to gain the upper hand. When their footsteps intertwined, and their bodies were close to each other, he whispered in Deanna's ear, "Merry Christmas." Christmas isn't here yet. Deanna wanted to say this, but she was pulled off the stage by Dake in a daze. 3 more to go. The stage on Christmas Eve seemed to have instantly turned into a duel arena in a race against time. Dake gently let go of Deanna's hand, and turned to look at the magic elves. Fairy Ibu was already jumping over like a rabbit with a happy face. Carat Omega Carat. It was finally Fairy Ibu's turn. It thought so. But between it and Dake, a hexagram array inlaid with stars and moons suddenly lit up. Eudora, who was part of the cheating trio, suddenly appeared from this array. Then, she pursed her lips tightly and grabbed Dake's hand with a face as red as an apple. Fairy Ibu's face flashed with surprise. Eudora, who had rehearsed alone in the dormitory again and again, lowered her head and looked at her toes. She kept pulling Dake's hand and walking towards the stage. She wouldn't ask. Although it was rude, she wouldn't be rejected if she didn't ask. She knew that Dake wouldn't stay still. She had already thrown caution to the wind. Sure enough, after a pause, Dake followed her strength and walked towards the stage. The prophecy succeeded. She was overjoyed. After walking on the stage, she tripped because she was too hasty. Extreme joy almost turned to sorrow. However, Dake looked at her slender and weak waist that could break at any time in an extremely elegant manner. Her face was as red as a rosy cloud, and her heart was unprecedentedly sweet. She really wanted to melt in his arms on the spot. After that, she didn't remember anything. Although she had practiced in front of the mirror many times, it was actually very difficult to make progress in dancing by herself. In the end, it was Dake who guided her through the entire song. These 5 to 6 minutes were like a dream. She couldn't tell if it was reality or illusion. The dream shone into reality. She was completely drunk. The alarm bell in Panduola Doragon's mind rang. Eudora threat +1. Eudora threat +1. Eudora threat +1. The notifications that kept popping up in her mind made her expression change slightly. She realized that she had underestimated this pink little girl. The most irresistible thing for humans was unrequited love. Eudora's behavior pattern made her, who was actually more rational, too puzzled. She even wondered if there was something wrong with this woman. However, she learned from Dake that not only was Eudora not sick, but she was also talented in astrology. The third dance song quietly ended. Dake led Eudora off the stage and whispered in her ear. Eudora shrank to the side with a red face. Then she was startled by Deanna, who patted her shoulder. Deanna didn't bite her. Dake knew that there wasn't enough time. However, he realized that he was no longer in control. Fairy Ibu looked at him angrily. Victoria's little face was puffed up like a meat bun. Aima was already considering whether to leave or not. Aurora stood there, tugging at the corner of her clothes. You have a soft mouth after eating someone's food. Dake sighed. He had no choice but to let his obedient baby suffer, and take the initiative to walk towards Aurora. He straightened his expression and tried to show the true colors of the Sea King. Then he stretched out his hand to Aurora, who had her head lowered. Aurora's mind instantly went blank. She picked up the bone that was thrown by others. No, since Dake took the initiative to invite her, of course, it couldn't be considered as a bone that was thrown by others. She maintained her last reservation and grabbed Dake's hand with a slight tremble. Then, she stepped gracefully onto the stage with him. The second half of the dance had been going on for 20 minutes. More teachers and students rushed onto the stage. Some even jumped directly around the stage. The atmosphere became more and more lively. She and Dake danced a beautiful waltz under the lights. During this period of time, Aima keenly discovered that Dake had something to do. So she glanced at the group of magic elves. After Dake and Eudora walked off the stage, she chose to attack decisively and won a stage victory. She decided to write this decisive victory in her diary. When she walked off the stage with Dake, it was already past 11:30. After all, Dake couldn't stop time. He could only accept this reality. Then he grabbed Fairy Ibu's ribbon antenna with one hand and Victoria's palm with the other. He was ready to kill them all. Together. After being stuck for a whole day, I finally finished writing. I woke up at 4 o'clock yesterday morning. Now it's 6 o'clock. I'll sleep for a while, and then get up to write the first chapter of March. I need a guaranteed monthly ticket and a guaranteed blade. You're tuning in to the Earbook Haven YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.